A few months ago, Moscow, Idaho was just a name to me, and it might be the same for you. But now, whenever I hear Moscow, Idaho, it's the first thing that comes to mind. The case I'm about to share took place in that very town, Moscow, Idaho, and centers around a mother of four who vanished in the spring of 2010. This is her story. We know that Washington and Idaho are right next to each other, and those close to the border regularly move between the two states. The first area of interest will be a town called Clarkston in Washington. I'll take you there before moving into how this is connected to Moscow. Clarkston, Washington is a small town that borders Idaho and is separated by the Snake River. The population back in 2010, when this case took place, was only about 7,200 people. It's located in what's called the Lewis-Clark Valley. That's where Clarkston gets its name from, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition. This was the United States expedition to cross the newly acquired western portion of the country after the Louisiana Purchase. Something I found interesting is that these two states are so connected that they refer to this area as the Lewiston-Clarkston, Idaho-Washington Metropolitan Statistical Area, MSA. They actually combine the two counties, one in Idaho and one in Washington, encompassing 5 Washington communities and 5 Idaho communities, even adding up the population total and including all of it in the census. So combined, this area had a population of about 60,000 people in 2010. That's not something I see very often, combining populations of 2 different states. It's also the 4th smallest metropolitan area in the United States. Here are 2 bridges along U.S. Route 95 that connect the 2 states in this area: the Southway Bridge and the Snake River Bridge. Rachael Anderson lived in Clarkston, Washington, specifically right here at 925 3rd Street. She had a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family home. It was beautiful, with original hardwood floors and a nice open kitchen. It was perfect for a little family. At the time, Rachael was a single mother of 4. 2 of her children were adults who had already moved out, and 2 were young boys living with her in Clarkston. But before I go any further, we need to go back to June 11th, 1969, in Belforche, South Dakota. That's where Rachael Lee Anderson was born. I couldn't find much about Rachael's childhood, and piecing together her family tree was also a very daunting task. I know for sure she had 2 sisters, a younger sister, Christina, and an older sister, Crystal. She may have also had a brother, Robert, but it was really hard to tell, even pulling information together from Facebook, since it wasn't clear who her parents were. However, there is still a lot to learn about Rachael. From what I could gather, it appears that her family moved from South Dakota to Lewiston, Idaho, though it's not certain when this occurred. By 1986, when Rachael was only 17, she was welcoming her first daughter into the world, little Amber. 1 year later, she gave birth to another daughter named Ashley. So, before the age of 20, Rachael was already the mother of 2 beautiful baby girls. It is unclear who she was married to at the time, but she was married a total of 4 times. Being close in age, I would assume that Ashley and Amber grew up side by side, forming a tight bond that shows later in life when tragedy strikes this family. Rachael was a young, adventurous, fun-loving mom who doted on her 2 girls. They were her world. They had the best birthday parties, and Rachael was an attentive mother who went out of her way to devote her time to teaching her children everything she could. She was intelligent, strong-willed, but humble and kind. By 2009, at 39 years old, Rachael's 2 daughters were already adults. Amber was 23, and Ashley was 22 years old. They were no longer living under their mother's roof, but from the records I pulled, they were living close by, sometimes in Idaho and other times in Washington. What is clear is that they were both close enough to get to Rachael's house within a reasonable amount of time, and both girls were very close to their mother. All 3 could pass as sisters, and sometimes that's the case when a woman has children at a young age. Rachael had 2 sons, a 5-year-old named Gavin and a 9-year-old named Aiden. She had been married and divorced 3 times as of 2009. Rachael was a petite brunette just over 5 feet tall with pretty brown eyes. She loved to laugh, smile, and absolutely adored her family. She took her role as a mom very seriously. She was a dedicated mom, who had already raised her 2 daughters and given them everything they could ever need to become outstanding women. She also took her job very seriously. She was a medical technician. As a single mom, her main goal was to provide a good life for her 2 young boys who were still under her roof. Rachael was known to be spunky and fun, and able to make friends quickly. One of her best friends at the time was Susie Jepson, and they had been friends from the day they met. There was just something magnetic about Rachael. Just looking at her smile alone, I imagined her having a sweet demeanor. She was someone you could count on. But there was something missing in Rachael's life: a man. It's true, she had already given it a go 3 times in the past, and those relationships just didn't work out for one reason or another. However, she desired a companion, someone by her side to enjoy her life with. She had just dealt with a guy that she was dating in 2008, William Slump, who became obsessed with her after she tried to break it off. He would randomly send her letters, asking if she was still interested. This was months later, and she would tell him no. But the letters would not stop. There was also a neighbor who kept asking her out on dates, even though she said she wasn't interested. Being attractive, Rachael did get her fair share of guys laying it on thick, trying to get her attention. Rachael was definitely interested in the idea of finding Mr. Right, and it happened in February of 2009. His name was Charles Capone, and yes, he shares the same last name as the notorious gangster, Al Capone. But Charles was a Christian man, and he really impressed Rachael. He would say blessings over their meals before they ate. He would make her laugh, and to her, he was very attractive. She was smitten. He was wholesome. He was the type of guy she could bring around her boys and not worry that he would be a bad influence. They started going to church together regularly, every Sunday. Charles also owned a successful auto repair shop called Palouse Multi-Services in Moscow, Idaho. The couple would travel back and forth between Washington and Idaho to visit one another. Something Rachael really admired about Charles was his giving nature and how compassionate he was. He would actually service people's cars free of charge if they were unable to make their payments. He was very devoted to his small community, and those who knew him respected Charles. That small community is Moscow, Idaho. It's about 40 minutes away from Clarkston. And coincidentally, Charles's body shop is just a 4-minute drive from 1122 Kings Road, the address of the home where the University of Idaho students were killed in November of 2022. I'm showcasing this to illustrate what a small world it is, but more so to show you what a small town Moscow is. There were only about 23,000 residents living in this area in 2010, with a local student population making up over half of that number, around 11,000 students, who come to the University of Idaho and reside in Moscow for that exact reason alone. It's known as a college town. The University of Idaho is only 1.2 miles away from the Washington border, and there's only a 9-minute drive between the University of Idaho and Washington State University. With the 2 schools being so close to one another, the 2 student populations mix and mingle with one another. Whether it's attending sporting events like the Vandals football game at the University of Idaho's Kibbe Dome, or a Cougar football game at Washington University's Martin Stadium. Xana Kernodle, one of the University of Idaho victims, had a sister who attended the neighboring WSU, and they were very close, hanging out together all the time. Not to mention the nightlife. Bars like the Coug are frequented by both Idaho and Washington students. As a matter of fact, Kaylee Goncalves, another one of the Idaho murder victims, was seen there on her 21st birthday. This was just on June 8, 2022. It's no surprise because it's literally called a college bar. There are even really tasty coffee shops like Dutch Bros where Kaylee used to work. I'm pointing this out because there are so many connections between these 2 towns and so much overlap with the residents. When Rachael and Charles were in Washington, on Rachael's side, there was a lot to do in Clarkston. Lots of fun activities for couples, like taking a tour of Basalt Cellars, which is an award-winning winery where they have handcrafted wine. It makes for a very romantic outing. Or they could visit the Riverport Brewing Company. It's the perfect place to relax, listen to music, and enjoy a cold beverage. The one thing that isn't on the menu in Clarkston is violent crime. According to Crime Scout, violent crime in Clarkston is about 2.37 per thousand residents, meaning crime in the area is relatively low. Residents could raise their families in a safe environment. It was hard to believe that anything sinister could happen in a sleepy, quiet northwestern town. And now, with Charles by Rachel's side, she felt even more at home, content, and ready to take the next step. The pair were officially married by September that same year. That's just 7 months after they met. It's definitely not uncommon when you're a little older, like in your late 30s or 40s, to just know when someone is right for you. They made a good team, and as a matter of fact, it wasn't long before Rachel was helping Charles with his auto repair business. The office really needed a woman's touch, and Rachel was more than willing to help. She rearranged the office, making things way more organized and helping to run the business more efficiently, which helped Charles save money in just a 2-month time. Charles even made Rachel an official partner in his company, and it wasn't long before the couple decided to move in together. Rachel and the boys were already settled in Clarkston, so Charles decided to move in with them, and it was really nice. They had somewhat of a father figure in the home now, and Charles took the boys fishing for the first time. Rachel enjoyed hunting, so she would put on full camo and accompany Charles with his buddies on hunting trips. But sometimes fun wears off. This happens, and it's very disappointing, but it was as though the honeymoon phase was over. I'm not sure why Rachel's other relationships didn't last, but for her and Charles, there was trouble in paradise. Just 2 months after their wedding, by December of 2009, they had decided to split up. Was it forever? They didn't know. They just knew they were doing a lot more bickering than loving at the moment. Couples go through these rough patches sometimes, and sometimes they get back together. Other times they don't, and they're better apart. Charles and Rachel still talked on a regular basis. Sometimes those conversations were great, and other times, they just could not see eye to eye. However, she did end up confiding in him when she started to get strange phone calls out of nowhere around the beginning of the year. These calls started to come in, but when Rachel picked up the phone, there was dead silence on the other line. Nothing. No one would respond, even when she asked who it was. But it didn't stop there. The calls progressed into music playing in the background, and it was muffled. No one would speak on the other line. Then she started to get phone calls from various telephone numbers with these creepy, disguised voices, and this is when it got really terrifying. The disguised voices would tell Rachel what she was doing, what specific lights were on in her home, as though they knew every move that she was making, like she was being watched. That's no joke. Enough was enough. At this point, Rachel was scared. She told her friend Jennifer Norberg that the caller would block their phone number, so Rachel couldn't tell where these calls were coming from. She obviously didn't recognize the voice because it didn't even sound real. It was very distorted, almost like a robot, and it was chilling. I have a few clips of this caller. They would leave messages on her voicemail box, so they're recorded, and I can play some of those clips now.
I just had to call back to let you know I don't owe you anything. I don't feel guilty about it, but I don't owe you anything. It's a matter of time before we get your cell phone number. And then we'll have fun texting again. Alright, bye.
It's as though these people want revenge of some kind. What's most disturbing to Rachel is that this caller seems to be right outside her home, and she has 2 young children inside. She didn't know what to expect or what this person would do. So far, things were escalating at a fast pace. What would happen next? What's after phone calls? She didn't want to find out. She was asking everyone she knew, even her neighbors, if they were responsible for these calls. She figured it had to be someone that knew her, someone who was always close by, because they'd say things like, "Why aren't you home right now? Where'd you go?" Or, "I just saw you turn off your bathroom light." Well, then Charles started getting the exact same phone calls with the silence on the other end, and then escalating into weird, distorted voice threats. They tried to think of who they could have annoyed or pissed off enough to play games like this. Was it a disgruntled customer? After a while, they both began taking it even more seriously, especially because other things were happening. It just didn't stop there. One afternoon, Rachel noticed the lock on her shed was broken. She knew she didn't break it, and she knew the boys didn't break it either. Then she heard something. She went out on the porch one night to see what was there, and she just found a bottle of men's cologne sitting on her porch. I found it strange. I also found it kind of funny for some reason. But it's not funny at all. This is serious. I just didn't understand why they would leave a bottle of men's cologne. What message are they trying to send? Does it even matter? The fact is, someone was definitely stalking Rachael, and it wouldn't be the first time, but it definitely was more serious than anything she had experienced in the past. But it only got worse. Rachael proactively reached out to law enforcement and let them know that she was being harassed. She called the Escalating County Police Department in Clarkston, Washington, and gave them all the details about what was going on. They instructed her to continue documenting any harassing messages or phone calls she received, but as I said, it only got worse. One night, she came outside her house to find that someone had slashed the tires on her white Dodge Stratus sedan. It was apparent that this person wasn't going to stop, but it was frustrating because she didn't know who was doing this. It was before the days of having a Ring camera. Unless someone actually saw the person doing it, it was almost impossible to figure out who it was. This person knew where she lived. They would tell her what time she came home and where she was standing in her own house. She knew they weren't scared to harm her car, so what would they do next? What about her? Would they take the next step and harm her or her family? Charles found out about what happened, and he told Rachael, "You know what? I will take care of everything. I will give you new tires, complimentary." Even though they were separate at the time, he had other cars on his lot that she could borrow as well, so she didn't have to worry herself with extra unexpected expenses or about not being able to drive her boys around for their activities. Again, Rachael reached out to the police department, and this time she told them she feared for her life. Multiple police reports were filed, and they even assigned her a detective. His name was Captain Dan Halley. She began checking in with him every single day, reporting that the calls were not stopping. Captain Halley reassured her that they were going to figure out everything. They were going to get to the bottom of this. Look at this. After the car was all fixed up, Rachael was at work one day. She came out in the middle of broad daylight to find that someone had literally smashed in the back windshield of her car. How is this even possible without being seen? Rachael was extremely frightened. She showed up again at the police department, speaking to Captain Halley in person, explaining everything to him once again. All the calls that she was receiving, that Charles was getting to, the weird messages, the threats, somebody knowing her every move, her vandalized shed, and now her car, twice. So, Captain Halley asked Rachael if she had any idea who could be behind all of this, and she said yes. She was confident it was that guy she dated for a few weeks back in 2008, William Slump. The guy who wouldn't take no for an answer and kept sending her letter after letter. She thought that he had finally stepped up his game because he found out that she was with Charles. Captain Halley said this was really good information and he was going to look into it. This was in the beginning of April, but it had been going on since the beginning of January. After this, Captain Halley and Rachael exchanged a number of phone calls, with Rachael inquiring as much as she could about the progress of her case. Meanwhile, the calls were still coming in. This stalking had compelled her to sleep in the living room of her home with the lights on instead of sleeping in her own bedroom. She wanted to be able to hear if someone came into her home, and many times she would actually have a friend stay over because she was that scared. Rachael finally decided to apply for a restraining order against William. It was the week of April 11th. Rachael had an appointment to meet with Captain Halley on Friday the 16th to turn over all the information that she had gathered about William, along with all the documented harassment, all the recorded messages, pictures of things that were broken or left behind, everything. But Rachael never made it to that appointment. It wasn't until Monday morning on April 19th that Rachael didn't show up for work, and her family got very concerned. Her daughter Amber received a phone call from St. Joseph's Regional Medical Center in the pathology lab, where Rachael was a medical technician. They told Amber that her mom never showed up for work that day. That was highly unusual, and coupled with the fact that Amber knew her mom was in fear for her life, she was beside herself. She had told her mom to go stay at someone's house, get out of town, do something. Just don't stay in that home. But Rachael refused to leave because of her children. Rachael had Aiden and Gavin, her 11 and 6-year-old sons, to tend to. They had school there, their lives were rooted in Clarkston. So where was she supposed to go? And where was she now? Could she be at the boys' school? Well, she wasn't there, which made Amber more concerned. The boys had been with their fathers that weekend, but Rachael was supposed to pick them up that Monday from school. She never showed up. That's when Amber knew she had to do something. There was just no way Rachael would have left her sons. She wouldn't do that. Rachael didn't just have 4 children. She also had 4 grandchildren, ages 5, 4, 2, and just 16 months old. She loved and cared deeply for those around her. If she left, Amber knew it wasn't on her own accord, and that scared her. The first stop was Rachael's house. Amber called her boyfriend and told him to go over to her sister Ashley's house right away to inform her of what was going on, and then she sped off to her mom's. Ashley was home with her daughter when Amber's boyfriend knocked on the door to inform her that Rachael was missing and that Amber was headed over to Rachael's to look for her. Ashley quickly jumped in her car to meet Amber over there. When she arrived, she was frantically asking Amber, "What is going on? Where's Mom?" Amber explained that she didn't know. Rachael didn't show up for work. She didn't pick up the boys. They tried the front door, but it was locked and their spare key didn't work anymore because Rachael, being afraid for her life, had recently changed her locks. Amber and Ashley considered breaking the door down, but they were scared of what they might find inside. If Amber and Ashley had discovered their mother's body, they didn't think they would ever be able to recover. They felt helpless. They just stood outside in the yard for so long, trying to figure out what to do next. They finally made the decision to call 911 and leave the task of investigating their mom's home to authorities. Amber also notified other family members, including Rachael's sisters, Crystal and Christina. Christina received a text that said, "Help, Mom's missing. No one has heard from her since Friday." When officers got worried about Rachael, they were in the middle of a briefing. A call came through about a missing person, and when Captain Halley heard the name, Rachael Anderson, it sent chills down his spine. He felt a knot in his stomach. He immediately feared that something terrible could have happened to her. He had just seen her on Wednesday and knew she was supposed to meet him on Friday. However, she canceled that appointment with him, and now she was being reported missing. This was not a good sign. Halley gave all of Rachael's information to one of the department's lead detectives, Jackie Nichols, and dispatched her to Rachael's home at 925 3rd Street. When she arrived, she saw several people in front of Rachael's home, including Rachael's daughters, Amber and Ashley, who were freaking out. They could not get the information out fast enough. They were telling the detective everything they knew, every little detail, down to the fact that Rachael had told Amber she thought the harassment she was experiencing would ultimately end in her death. Can you imagine that those were the last words your mother said to you and now she's missing? Detective Nichols looked around the house on the outside, trying to figure out if any windows were open or if she could get through any other doors, and she found a way inside through a back door, so she did not have to break into the residence. And that's kind of alarming. If it's that easy to get right into Rachael's home, wouldn't you think it would be on lockdown, considering how scared she was? So, Amber and Ashley are just waiting, holding their breath, hoping that their mom is not dead inside. However, after a thorough walkthrough, Detective Nichols does not find anything noteworthy. No signs of a struggle, no blood, and no Rachael. It's bittersweet. On one hand, their worst fear has not come true. Rachael wasn't found deceased. On the other hand, she's truly missing. There were no bags packed or missing from the home. Rachael's toothbrush was still in the bathroom. It didn't appear as though she left town, and her daughters knew she wouldn't do that anyway, not without telling them. So now what? While the police department opens an official case, the detectives get to work fast. They need to confirm that Rachael has not left town on her own, so they check the airlines, bus records, and even make sure she's not in the hospital or in jail. Everyone knew Rachael was glued to her cell phone, she would not have left them hanging. Everyone was sitting there, calling and texting, trying to get a hold of her. Where could she be, where she wouldn't have access to her phone? Her phone may hold a clue, though. Modern technology comes in handy in these cases, so they look into getting Rachael's phone records. They already looked at her bank records, and there was no activity from Rachael since Friday night, April 16th. Her daughter said that this is highly unusual. Rachael was a shopper. She was always buying something. Even if it was something small, she would have used that card. Since Friday, they're trying to build a timeline. It's as though Rachael has actually been missing for 3 days because it is Monday, so we've got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and now she's still not here. Amber wasn't going to just stand around and do nothing. She had 1,000 flyers printed, and she was passing them around, hanging them up everywhere around town. There was a picture of Rachael on these flyers, along with her description. 5 feet 4 inches, approximately 120 pounds, small stature, black hair, brown eyes, and a number to call in case anyone had seen or heard from her. Not only that, but Amber immediately went straight to the media. She needed to get the word out. And once she got it out locally, tons of local news stations and then beyond started to run Rachael's story. Amber spoke with reporters at every single opportunity she had. She was adamant about keeping her mom's name and picture in the news because it meant more pressure on the police to get to the bottom of this, to find her mom. They sent one of their reporters out to Clarkston as soon as the news broke. They were like, "Pack your bags, get in your car, and go." And I don't want to say this phrase because it's not exactly where we are right now, but if it bleeds, it leads. I hate the phrase, but it's true. They showcased the missing persons flyer during this news segment, and they interviewed Amber.
Just keep your eye out, keep spreading the word, and if anybody had seen her or the vehicle over the weekend, we want to report it to the police.
This would not be Amber's last time making a plea to the public to help find her mom. She started a Facebook page called "Help Me Find My Missing Mom, Rachael Anderson." She was so desperate for answers that she asked in a post on Facebook if anyone knew how to read forensic astrology charts. I have to say, I'd never heard of one of these before. Had you? Because I know I did not. But according to Slate.com, these forensic astrologers search the skies for clues to earthly crimes. What do you think about all this? Because recently, TikTok psychics have come under fire for committing actual defamation by accusing people or predicting suspects of a crime. A forensic astrology chart takes the date that the person went missing, and then you create a last seen chart, which is similar to a birth chart if you've ever seen one of those before. You put the date and the time you were born, and it tells you where the sun, the moon, and the planets were at that time. This is supposed to help guide you. The same applies to a forensic chart. These astrologers use the placements on this chart to try to pinpoint who the suspects are, or even where a body is located. In case you're curious and want to try this, there is a link in my sources below for forensicastrologer.com. This includes a crime chart and instructions on how to use it. Meanwhile, detectives decided to emergency ping Rachael's phone. It's called an exigent circumstances ping. This gives them a chance to track where the phone was last active. Within hours, they get the information. A hit on that last ping. It was linked to Lewiston, Idaho, the same city where Rachael worked, so it seemed very helpful. Maybe her car broke down, and then her phone died when she was going to work. Maybe she's stranded somewhere. But when detectives really pinpointed the exact area, it led them to a vast empty field in the middle of nowhere, a very agricultural area that included deep canyons in Nez Perce County, in the area of Warner Road and Lindsay Creek Road. It's just rolling hills and dirt grass as far as the eye can see. Here it is, right on the screen. It's very far out of the way from where Rachael would have been going, but it's only a 13-minute drive away from her home. The Escalating County Sheriff's Office needed help, so they enlisted multiple jurisdictions to assist in their search. Were they looking for Rachael, dead or alive? Was it too late? Why would her phone be in an empty field? Rachael's immediate and extended family banded together, walking around for hours with officers, searching all day and into the night, all over the area where Rachael's phone last pinged. There were volunteer search and rescue groups, canine bloodhounds, And then, bad news. Rachel's phone was no longer logging activity. They believed that the emergency ping probably drained what was left of her battery, or the phone was powered off. By the next day, on Tuesday, April 20th, Captain Holly formed a task force. Their first order of duty was to track down William Slump. Remember him? They also wanted to check out Rachel's other exes, her ex-boyfriends, ex-husbands, and the neighbor Rachel had reported who kept persistently asking her out on dates. Anyone could be a suspect at this point. They also had information that the person stalking Rachel had also been harassing her husband, Charles Capone. So they needed to know more. Maybe Charles could provide additional examples of these messages, and maybe they could link them to Rachel's whereabouts. Detectives had already talked to neighbors and family members, and now it was time to go a little deeper. We all know the first person they look at is going to be the boyfriend or the husband of a missing woman. Charles was high up on their list for two reasons. He was close with Rachel, and he was also being harassed, seemingly by the same person. He could be in danger. Captain Halley, along with the Moscow Police Department, made a trip over to Charles's auto shop, which was in Moscow, Idaho. Right away, it was as though Charles was actually relieved that Captain Halley was there, because he explained that Rachel had already shared Captain Halley's information with him and told him that he was the one helping her with the stalker. So Charles let Halley know that he was also trying to help Rachel get to the bottom of it, but he didn't have any real leads. They had also changed their phone numbers, but this person still found them. However, he did have Rachel's car as evidence of the damage that the stalker had done, since he was currently repairing it for the second time. First, it was the slashed tires, and then it was that back windshield. Charles also let the police listen to the voice messages that were on his phone, as well as read all of the texts he had been receiving, which he had shared with Rachel. They sounded exactly the same. Plus, one of the voice messages that was on Rachel's phone even mentioned Charles, not by name, but listen to this.
We've tried to explain things. We tried texting, tried messing with your almost ex-husband. He didn't get it. He changed his phone number. You changed your phone number. You never apologize. You see us all the time. It's funny. You just don't get it.
The creepy caller refers to him as her almost ex-husband and says they've tried messaging him repeatedly, messing with him, and how they both changed their numbers to try to throw this person off to no avail. I noticed that they also said, "You never apologized to us." At the time, they said us. So who are they? The detectives also asked Charles when he last saw Rachel, and he told them it was on Friday evening. She came by to exchange vehicles, but he had a very busy day that day and wasn't done fixing her car, so he loaned her a white GMC Yukon. Charles was very cooperative the entire time and was shocked to learn that Rachel was missing, but he also figured there had to be a reasonable explanation. Still, the officers had to ask him point blank if he had anything to do with her disappearance, and he said no. Then they asked if he had anything to do with her tires being slashed, and again he said absolutely not. Last, they asked if he broke her windshield, and again he said no. Charles said he had nothing to hide and admitted that, sure, they were separated, but they were still close. He even drove around with Rachel, looking for her ex, William Slump. He had planned to tell the guy off. They had even connected one of the phone numbers that were calling and texting them to a payphone close to where William lived. They felt like they were on the right track, but now Rachel was gone. Officers wanted to know what happened after Rachel was informed that her car wasn't ready that night. He explained that Rachel went to Office Depot to look for a computer. She bought the computer and then decided to stop at a convenience store where she picked up a pack of beer for them. She came back to the shop, they had a couple of beers together, they hung out for a little bit, then she said she had to go and she left. This gives detectives another clue. Rachel was under the influence. How many beers did she actually have? Sometimes when people say, "Oh, I had a couple of beers," it turns out it was way more than 2. She could have gotten into an accident. So, they decided they had enough information from Charles at this point. They set off to retrace Rachel's path from Charles's repair shop back to her home in Clarkston. As you see, It's a route that consists of vast amounts of land on both sides, down Highway 95. Look, she passes right through this land with canyons, and it looks very similar to the fields where her family was searching. Could she have ended up here instead? Well, something did. The next day, on April 21st, the 1997 white GMC Yukon that Rachael was borrowing and that she was last seen leaving Charles's shop with, was found. It was right here in this parking lot. It was unlocked, the keys were still inside, and her purse was in plain sight. This Dynamo gas station is definitely on her way home from Moscow, but it doubled as something else. It was actually a bus station. I know I had never seen this before, but the North Lewiston Dynamart in Lewiston, Idaho, is a Greyhound curbside stop. You can purchase a ticket and be picked up by the bus right here. It seemed like a positive thing. Maybe Rachael did leave on the bus, but the fact that she left behind our personal belongings and her phone stopped pinging in a random field did not add up. Rachel's sister both said that Rachael always hid her purse out of sight if she was going to go into a store for a moment. Seeing it out in the open like that was a big red flag. Granted, this bus station is only 8 minutes away from where Rachel's phone pinged and a 9-minute drive from her house. I don't know if the times were the same back then, but in 2010 on the website it says that the stop closes at 7 p.m. So what time did Rachael leave Moscow and why would she go to a bus station? It did not make sense, or did it? Detectives realized there could be a very horrifying connection between where they located this Yukon vehicle and a recent abduction of 2 girls just a few weeks before in March. These 2 women were leaving a Snoop Dogg concert in Portland, Oregon, when a man named Paul Winkleblack approached them. Paul told them that he worked for the Portland Police Department as a spotter. I don't even know what that is, but he said that he just wanted to help these ladies. He told them that they seemed to be intoxicated, and he didn't want police to come and arrest them for drunk driving. So Paul told them that they needed to be escorted out of this parking lot immediately. Both of the girls were like, no thanks, and they declined Paul's offer and got back into their vehicle. But then he wouldn't leave. Instead, he was standing outside their car, and he told them that the police were going to be waiting for them and that they would be stopped if they drove off. So these women were scared. They didn't really know what to do. They felt like they were kind of out of options. They had consumed drinks that night, and they wanted to avoid being pulled over and getting a DUI. So that's when the women decided that they were just going to leave their vehicle in the parking lot overnight and find another way home. But Paul said he was going to have their car towed if they left it unattended. So due to them feeling like they were between a rock and a hard place, with a lack of options and trusting that this man worked for the police, the 2 women actually let Paul drive them in their car. They believed this was Paul's responsibility as a police officer to get them home safely. Paul drove around downtown Portland. He then merged onto I-4 and he started to go south. That's when he took out a knife and he started to threaten one of the women, and he forced her to take several pills. The car then slowed down on the Detroit Lakes exit, and Paul pulled to the side of the road as the woman attempted to escape, but he took out his knife again. One woman, however, did escape, and she ran to a house and begged them to please let her use the phone to call 911. Meanwhile, the second woman also managed to somehow escape from him. I don't know how, and she just hid. The Marion County Sheriff's Office responded, and they located both of these women, but Paul Winkleblack fled. This man was still on the loose, and get this, his cell phone was found within a couple of miles of this same parking lot where the Yukon was at the time this occurred. This man had an outstanding warrant for third-degree sexual assault, a probation violation, and he was a registered offender. And I think you know what kind I'm talking about. Detectives started to wonder if Paul had anything to do with Rachael's disappearance. He was in the area weeks ago, but they didn't see any concrete connection between the 2. But he is on their list for now. They get a search warrant for the GMC Yukon that Charles let Rachael borrow, and it was impounded at the crime lab for inspection. Meanwhile, detectives tracked down the suspicious neighbor, the one who kept asking Rachael out on dates. It turns out he left town right after Rachael went missing, but when he was questioned, he had a rock-solid alibi. And remember William Slump, the ex-boyfriend? Well, as unwelcoming as his letters were to Rachael, he denied being involved in any harassment. He also had an alibi, and it checked out. They were back to square one, so they turned to the media for help. They wanted to know if anyone had seen the 1997 white GMC Yukon anywhere that Friday night between Moscow and Clarkston on April 26th. The Lewiston Morning Tribune put out this information. Anyone who may have noticed suspicious activity possibly involving a white GMC Yukon on back roads or highways between Moscow and Clarkston in the late night hours of April 16th or the early morning hours of April 17th is asked to report the incident to police. Detectives are also interested in suspicious activity north of Moscow during the same time frame. Now that they have all of Rachael's phone records, they're able to establish how creepy these calls were. The caller was using a service called spoofcard.com. This was an app that changes your voice, and it also hides your phone number. Digging deeper, the detectives discover Rachael was also receiving emails that were anonymously sent with pictures of mutilated bodies from unsolved murder cases. No wonder this woman was sleeping on the couch with the lights on and a loaded gun by her side. Now it's time for detectives to look at Rachael's debit card activity. They wanted to confirm the computer purchase and the stop at that convenience store, but there were no charges and it seemed really suspicious. So they asked Charles, and he told them, "I gave her my debit card." He said it was typical for them to both purchase things from each other's accounts, so he said that he gave the debit card to her when she came to the shop. When they ran his records, they were able to confirm the exact time that he checked out at that Office Depot that Friday night. It was around 6 p.m. It took about 20 or 30 minutes in the store, and then she went to a 3rd Street market where she purchased a pack of beer. Both of those charges were on Charles's debit card, and the receipt for that shows that she purchased it at 7:07 p.m., so that means she wouldn't have been able to get on a bus at the bus station. Then she went back to Charles's repair shop, according to Charles. But how could this be confirmed? Well, it wouldn't be confirmed by Charles because his lawyer told him to stop communicating with police. It's actually pretty normal to retain an attorney, even in this situation, if you're not guilty and they're just digging into Charles's life at this point. So it's wise for him to protect himself, but they also see this as a red flag. Why stop talking to them? Doesn't he want to help? Well, maybe not. It turns out Charles was in trouble. This was unrelated to what was happening with Rachael, but while interviewing him and doing a background check and searching his auto shop, detectives discovered firearms in his possession, and they issued a warrant for his arrest. The 48-year-old was charged with 2 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. Charles is being accused of possessing a Glock pistol, a Remington rifle, and a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun. This wouldn't exactly be an issue if it wasn't for the fact that Mr. Charles, I'm a holy Christian that blesses meals in public, Capone was a convicted felon, and I doubt that Rachael knew about this. Felons can't possess firearms. Charles had been convicted of aggravated battery and burglary in 1998 in Layton County, Idaho, and get this, bank larceny. Seriously, how does somebody hide something like this? That was back in 1997. So eventually Charles is arrested on these firearm charges. Here's what KXLI News had to say following his federal arraignment in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Today, Capone pled not guilty to 2 counts of possession felony of a firearm with his court-appointed lawyer sitting by his side. The Moscow business owner was arrested on May 6th after detectives found firearms belonging to Capone, a violation of his probation. Capone was the last person to see Rachael Anderson alive when the Clarkston woman disappeared on April 16th. No one has seen her since.
So there you have it. Rachael's estranged husband behind bars until July, and Rachael is still missing. So he needed an attorney for sure, and I doubt he wanted to be linked to the disappearance of his estranged wife on top of these other charges. But is he connected? Detectives decide to canvass the area around the repair shop in Moscow, Idaho. They also obtained a search warrant for the shop itself. They want to see if anyone saw Rachael or the white Yukon. And finally, they get a big break in the case. Tim Fountain was in his front yard playing with his mom's dog on the evening of Friday, April 16th. He said he was outside for about 15 minutes when he saw a vehicle entering the parking lot at Charles's repair shop. The reason this caught his attention was because of the way it skidded to a stop in front of Charles's shop. It was as though the driver was aggressively driving in a threatening way. Tim knew that Charles was the owner, and he recognized him standing outside. Tim saw a dark-haired woman jump out of the vehicle and start to scream at Charles. She was flailing her arms, and she got right in his face, and Charles kept responding calmly, but he sounded like he was restrained. Every time the woman would pause, it was like he was holding back. So the detectives asked him what he thought was going on. He said it just looked like a man and his wife disagreeing over something. When they asked him for more details on what the woman looked like, he said he was like 50 feet away and he couldn't make out any facial features. But the woman was a similar height as Charles, except thin. You could only really make out their silhouettes of their upper body. Tim wasn't able to tell what make or model vehicle it was, or even what color it was. But when he was asked if it could be a GMC Yukon, he said, yeah, it could have been. He also had no idea what either one of them was saying to each other. He just based everything on the body language and the tone as the noise traveled. The police wanted to know what else Tim saw. He told them that he noticed Charles would walk in and out of the doorway, but the lady would just continue to scold him. She would never go all the way inside. She just kind of lingered in the doorway, half in and half out. However, it's what he told them next that was absolutely chilling. He said he went back to play with his mom's dog. He turned his back to the shop and then he heard the last words he would from that woman. According to Tim, she said, no. Then she inhaled. It was like a no, a shocking sound coming out of her mouth. Then he heard a loud bang, and he said it sounded like metal hitting metal. It could have even been a large caliber pistol, but whatever it was, it definitely came from that shop. After that, he didn't hear or see the woman again. Tim said there were just no voices, it was silent, so he assumed that maybe something tipped over. He started to walk towards the shop to see if anyone was hurt, and that's when he saw the door open and close a couple of times. At this time, he was close enough to where he could hear a second man talking to Charles. He didn't know who the man was or where he came from, but he said he heard two men. He heard one man ask Charles a question, and Charles replied. Tim was curious. He continued to walk across his yard to the road between his mom's house and the shop, and that's when he saw the woman's vehicle heading towards the highway. When asked who was driving, Tim said he could not tell, and he didn't know which direction the car went in. What he could hear when he was about 35 feet away was what sounded like an object being moved inside. It sounded like a table was being pushed across the floor, then possibly something like a pressure washer starting up. After that, he went back to his mom's yard and continued playing with his dog, just throwing the ball back and forth. He told detectives he didn't think anything was wrong. He believed the woman got into the vehicle and drove off. But authorities were not so sure. They got a more extensive search warrant for the premises and were still thoroughly analyzing the Yukon, which just turned up some very questionable evidence. They found the tip of a finger of a black latex glove, like it had been torn off, and that was in the front seat. There was a piece of paper in the vehicle that had information regarding that computer that Rachael was going to purchase from Office Depot, and the paper appeared to have what looked like a blood smear on the bottom of it. Then they opened up Rachael's purse, and they saw what looked like blood droplets inside. On the inside, there was a bag of paperwork that belonged to Rachael, located in the back seat. And the bag contained all of those notes, all the paperwork that Rachael was supposed to bring to that appointment at the police department with Captain Halley. The vehicle was otherwise very clean, and that was actually unusual. Rachael's friends and family said that's not Rachael. Rachael leaves vehicles very cluttered and messy, even if she's only been driving a car for a day. I never knew something like that would come in handy as a clue, but that was part of Rachael's character. So the lack of clutter actually stood out here. Not only that, the driver's seat was pushed back into a position where it wouldn't have been appropriate for someone of Rachael's stature, indicating that someone else was the last person to drive that vehicle. But what's even more telling and scarier and more damning is that a cadaver dog hid on the cargo area in the back of that vehicle. These are the kind of dogs that are trained to detect human remains, not blood, so this isn't good. They sent the items to get DNA tested, and meanwhile, something else was found inside the Yukon that changed the narrative. Divorce papers. We know that Charles and Rachael are separated, but Charles made it seem like they were working things out. To the contrary, according to the divorce documents found in the Yukon, Rachael filed for divorce as early as January 8th. There was a letter attached from her attorney, Scott Galena, and a second divorce document dated January 14th. Detectives do not think it's a mere coincidence that these documents were inside this vehicle. They looked freshly printed, waiting for a signature from none other than Charles Capone himself. This leads them to believe Rachael intended to present those papers to Charles that night. Coupled with the eyewitness testimony from that neighbor, Tim Fountain, it's looking as though Charles is their number one suspect. He had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to harm Rachael. They just needed proof because we know people are innocent until proven guilty. They pulled up Charles's and Rachael's phone records, including all of their text messages from the days leading up to the disappearance and on the day she went missing. I don't know if you like these kinds of details, but I do. I love when I can get records and read through them. So I'm going to do that. There's not that many of them. I just find them to be very telling. On April 16th, there's a text from Charles to Rachael at 7:38 a.m. It said, "It took me a while to figure out why you wouldn't take my truck. It's not misleading to me. It's that you have been either ashamed of me because you hang up when you get to Dermis's, because you tell him you don't talk to me, and you're not telling your kids either. I'm not someone who needs to be kept in the closet. I understand, but not at my cost." Rachael. Definitely sounds like Charles is a little bit bitter. I'm not sure who the Dermis's person is, but maybe that's someone Rachael's talking to or dating. Then at 11:18 a.m., Charles texted Rachael and said, "You have more money in your account. I will do the car payment next." So, okay, it does seem as though Charles is helping to pay her bills and to deposit funds into her bank account. Remember, they were essentially working the repair business together. And then, right after this, Rachael called the office depot in Moscow, Idaho, and she asked them to hold the computer for her and said that she would come get it sometime later that day. Okay, we know from Charles that Rachael supposedly did go back to pick up this computer. Now bear with me on these next ones. I promise this will all make more sense as I integrate more information about who these people are in the next couple of minutes. But the next text message that Charles sends is to a friend named Bert Bogdan. Charles has been currently living with Bert and his wife, Carol, and they've been allowing Charles to live with them while he was separated from Rachael. We will hear more about him because detectives are going to bring in Bert for an interview along with anyone else that's mentioned or texted. At 1:37 p.m., Charles texted Bert and said, "Hey Bert, I'm curious if you have any openings at Amplicon that you need filled." Just 10 minutes later, at 1:48 p.m., Bert texted Charles back and said, "We do not in the foreseeable future. Next step would be a mid-level PhD in microbiology or bioinformatics." To which Charles texted Bert back and said, "Thought I would check because I know someone with a lot of skills in office and lab environments." It sounds like to me, from what I know, Charles is hoping that he can find a position for Rachael. She's currently a lab technician. I don't know if she holds a PhD in microbiology or bioinformatics, but it seems as though money is an issue, and the next text kind of confirms this. Listen, at 2:23 p.m., Charles texted Rachael and said, "I'll get a second job at Walmart stocking. It's almost $13 an hour, and I can do 25 hours a week. You have the boys, and I have no life, so what the heck is an extra $800 a month?" Then, 10 minutes later, at 2:31, Charles texted Rachael and said, "Just made the car payment. Insurance is next." I didn't know what to make of these text messages. They didn't sound threatening. They sounded desperate to me. It's as though he's trying to prove to Rachael that he can still support them. But these next two calls are really significant. Later that evening, Rachael called Charles at 6:59 p.m. for 1 minute. Rachael's cell phone hit the cell tower between downtown Moscow and Charles's shop. This is called the Paradise Creek Tower. In the same minute, 6:59, Rachael calls him a second time for under a minute, and her cell hits the same tower, between downtown Moscow and Charles's shop again. That's the Paradise Creek Tower. But just a couple of minutes later, at 7:02, Rachael called Charles for 2 minutes. This time her cell phone hits the tower closer to Charles's shop. It's called Paradise Ridge Tower, not the Paradise Creek Tower. This shows that she was either very close to or actually at his shop at this time, which does coincide with the information that they were given from Charles. Then, at 7:15 p.m., Charles called Rachael's phone for 2 minutes, and his cell phone hit the same tower at his shop, Paradise Ridge. 5 minutes later, at 7:20, Charles called Rachael for 2 minutes again, hitting the tower by his shop, Paradise Ridge. 10 minutes later, at 7:30 p.m., Charles called Rachael's phone for 4 minutes, with his cell phone hitting the same tower, Paradise Ridge. I'm just sitting here thinking, why all these phone calls? Why now? At 8:09 p.m., Rachael called one of her ex-husbands, Dennis Plunkett. She has the 6-year-old son, Gavin, with him, and she leaves him a voice message saying that she had a question for him. This was the last outgoing call or text from Rachael's phone. This call hit off the Paradise Ridge Tower, so we know she was alive and well at 8:09 p.m. on Friday night, and probably at Charles's shop. We know Tim Fountain saw a woman there that night. At 8:27 p.m., Charles sent a text to Rachael. The text hit a tower by Charles's shop, Paradise Ridge. A couple of minutes later, at 8:29, Rachael's ex-husband Dennis, the one that she just called, attempted to call her back, but it went straight to voicemail. That time, the call hit an unknown tower, and there are reasons for this. But again, at 8:38 p.m., Dennis tried to call Rachael again, but it went to voicemail, and it hit an unknown tower. The reason that it hits an unknown tower most times is that either a phone has no service, is turned off, or is in airplane mode, so it's not actually hitting off anything at this point. By 9:20 p.m., all incoming texts and calls to Rachael's phone went unanswered, and it was hitting off the 500 Fan Road Tower until the phone died or was shut off at 3:03 p.m. on April 19th, when the emergency pinged it to get its location. I looked at the location of the cell tower, and it is right near that field where Rachael's cell phone last pinged. I love details because we get to see exactly what the detectives were finding, step by step, and how it's all coming together. That night at 9:59 p.m., Charles's phone shows duplicate text messages to Rachael. I was wondering why sometimes, if it doesn't go through to someone's phone, the person will text again. And that's what I think was happening here. The first one that was a duplicate said, "I'm sorry, Rachael. I did the best I could to get it done." It was sent twice, like I said, probably because it wasn't going through. At 10:08 p.m. again, a duplicate text message saying hello, as though he's checking in to see if she's ignoring him. At 10:15 p.m., Charles's phone shows a text to Rachael saying, "I finished it, you can have it tomorrow. Please call me," with 3 exclamation points. Charles doesn't text Rachael again until the next morning on Saturday. This is at 8:01 a.m., and he says, "Hey, I know you're impatient, but I did it as fast as I could. Can you get up here today, or I will meet you halfway?" No response from her. So at 9 a.m., Charles texts her again with, "I'm at the shop all day. Call me, and we can swap rigs." Rigs is how Charles refers to different vehicles, which I found was actually a weird way to do so since, I don't know, I think it refers more to a sailing instrument or a device like a light rig. A rig is how he refers to vehicles. So now you know. Later, at 1:37 p.m., Charles texted Rachael's phone and said, "It's after lunch, are you gonna call? Are you still mad about not getting the car? Call me back." No response from Rachael. So at 5:43 p.m., Charles texted again with, "Hello, hello, hello," sent 2 times. Finally, at 6:30 p.m., Charles texted her phone, "Hey, your mailbox on your home cell is full. What's the deal? Why are you being so standoffish today?" Charles doesn't text again until the next morning on Sunday at 8:54, asking her, "Are you going to church? Are you going to call?" Nothing. At 1:01 p.m., Charles texted Rachael's phone again saying, "Rachael, what's wrong? We do need to trade vehicles. Stop ignoring me." And that was sent 2 times. Nothing is sent back from Rachael. Then at 7:22 p.m., Charles texted her, "Okay, enough is enough. You need to call me. I'm not liking the silent treatment. But he didn't text her again that night. Of course, he did start back up the very next day on Monday, pretty early this time at 6:31, and he said, "Hello, I gave you all weekend and you ignored me. Stop. After work today, I really need to get the Yukon back. Bert's leaving for Japan, and I think he has people coming in from out of town, and they will need the extra rig. So this Yukon I told you about, that Rachel's been borrowing, that's actually Bert's vehicle." But at this point, it seems as though Charles is using that fact to put more pressure on Rachael to return the car, or to meet up with him or call him back. But there is still no answer from Rachael. Now remember, Rachael did not show up to work on Monday. It turns out she also missed work on Saturday, but her workplace let that one slide, as though it was maybe a one-time thing, even though she never called in. By Monday, they were concerned. That morning, however, Charles called the pathology lab, and he was looking for Rachael. He didn't identify himself, but he said that he's been working on her car and it's ready for pickup. According to the person who took this call at Rachel's work, Charles told them that he called the police in Clarkson to report her missing. However, there is no report of Charles ever calling law enforcement, which is pretty interesting. Charles also called Rachel's daughter Amber at 12:30, and this is after Amber had reported Rachael missing. Amber told detectives that Charles called her and said that he had accidentally turned his phone off for the 4 previous hours if she had tried to call him. That's really interesting. Why would it be significant? By 2:45, Rachel's phone pings out in that empty field in the middle of nowhere. It would have been really convenient if Charles had turned off his phone so he could drive over there and dump Rachel's phone out in the middle of the field, wouldn't it? That's what detectives are thinking. Or was it just a coincidence? Then, at 6 p.m., Charles talked to Amber on the phone, and according to Amber, Charles said that he was going to come down to Lewiston, where the phone pinged, and he was going to help them search for Rachael. But he never showed up. It doesn't really sound like a man who cared about this woman. By the very next day, on Tuesday, April 20th, Charles was contacted by law enforcement at his shop, and we know what he told detectives. Now let me tell you what was obtained through the extensive search warrant of that shop. Initially, they merely took a look inside while they were talking to Charles, but after his arrest, they were able to get a more extensive warrant. While searching the auto repair shop, a box of black latex gloves was found in Charles's truck. In the loft of his shop, there was a blue tarp covering items that had a lot of paint overspray on them. There was another green tarp that appeared to be brand new. But they also found something they considered even more significant. It was a prescription bottle of Ambien. This is a sleeping pill, and it has a familiar name on it, Carol Bogdan. That's not Charles's name, that is the wife of Bert. Charles is living with them. It was time for detectives to pay them a little visit and find out what's going on here. Why would sleeping pills be at Charles's workplace? It's not as though you typically take them during the day. Plus, he's in possession of prescription drugs that do not belong to him. This prescription was for 15 pills, and it states to take half a pill at a time. There were only 14 pills in the bottle. Do the math. Carol Bogdan was interviewed, and she said Charles had been staying with her since February. The detectives confronted her about the Ambien, and she told them she never gave Charles a bottle of medication, but in fact she had given him 1 or 2 pills to help him sleep. He later approached her husband and told them about the bottle of Ambien that was in the shop. During that meeting, Charles reportedly said to Bert that police were only going to see it the way they wanted to, and he said, "I bet they think I put sleeping pills in Rachel's beer." But at that point, no one in that investigation had said anything about putting any drugs in Rachel's beer, so that definitely looks suspicious. Carol also tells him that Charles was not home by midnight on April 16th, and that she didn't even see him when she woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. When she did finally see him that night, he was acting unusually. When detectives interview her husband, Bert Bogdan, he tells them that Charles was trying to win Rachael back. He was trying to save the marriage, doing everything he could, looking for books for them, doing therapy appointments, paying her bills, paying her car payments. But there was something Bert didn't like that Charles was doing. He was following Rachael around, sitting outside her house, and obsessing over whether or not she was dating other men. Charles told Bert that he had been at Rachael's one time, and he hid and watched and waited for her to come home one night. Then, around 1:30 in the morning, he told Bert she was drunk and alone, and Bert said, "You are stalking her." That's when Bert said to Charles, "Do you have a gun?" And he said, "Yeah." And Bert actually talked Charles into giving him that gun for safekeeping. Bert told the detectives he didn't know what Charles might do in the state of mind he was in after the breakup. The timeline of when this occurred lines up with when Rachael first started to contact the Clarkson Police Department about getting those weird text messages around February 21st. She actually told them, according to records, that she thought it might even be Charles, but she wasn't as confident since she was leaning more towards it being William. Bert also told detectives that at 6:15 p.m. the night that Rachael went missing, Bert was with his kids at Baskin-Robbins in Moscow, and he saw Rachael drive by in his Yukon. He had given Rachael permission to use it, and he said he was positive it was his Yukon, and he was positive that Rachael was driving. He did not see Charles come home that night, and at 8:15, the next morning on Saturday, Bert and Carol noticed that Charles was still not home. So they assume he came home after they went to bed and must have left before they woke up. But they don't know if he ever came home during that night. It wasn't until 6:30 p.m. that Saturday night that Charles came back home. That's when Carol went into Charles's room to let him know that she had some food for him, and she found him completely passed out, sleeping. He would kind of wake up, but then he would fall right back to sleep. He must have been really tired. I wonder why. The next day on Sunday, the Bogdans said that Charles got up and went to church. When he came back, he helped them with some yard work, and he seemed fine on Sunday. On Tuesday, the day the detectives went out to the repair shop to talk to Charles, he came home to the Bogdans and told them, according to him, that he had been interrogated all day by the police, later telling Bert, "Everything will be okay because I have an ace." Charles said that he was with someone on Friday, someone who could account for his whereabouts. But why didn't he give anyone the name of this person? This makes sense with what we heard from Tim Fountain. He said he heard two men at the shop that night. So who was there, and why hadn't they come forward? That same night, Bert asked Charles to move out of their home. He did. He moved into the Hillcrest Motel. Then later on May 5th, Charles was arrested on that firearm charge. But right before he got arrested that day, guess where else he was? At Bert's place of business, a laboratory where they conduct testing. He came there around 11:30 a.m., and that's when Bert told Charles, "If you have anything to do with Rachael's disappearance, you need to tell everything to the police." Charles said his family said the same thing, and that he told them, "No way." I wondered if he meant, "No way, I didn't do it," or "No way, am I going to police?" This is also when Charles mentioned the sleeping pills. I told you he thought, "Oh, they're gonna think I put one in Rachael's beer," and it was interesting because there was one missing. Charles also confided in Bert that he found out since Rachael's disappearance that she had a boyfriend, and that's when he said, "You know what? The cops would really be questioning him, not me." Then he went on to say that the police asked him for a sample of his DNA, and that's when the conversation got weird, as though it wasn't already weird. But Charles proceeds to ask Bert if the police can find DNA in sweat, and that he wanted to find out if the police were doing the DNA work correctly. Why is he trying to check on the police's work? Like, why is he doing that? Bert answered by telling Charles that was not the kind of DNA work that his company was involved in, so he did not know the answer to that. Then, the room that Charles was staying in at the Bogdans was searched, and various items were taken into evidence, including the tip of a black latex glove and some black hair. Another tip-off of a glove? Everything's really adding up. Well, there's more. Detectives need to know who this ace is. The person Charles was telling Bert could verify his alibi. So they're going down a list of potential people, friends of Charles's, and they come across Tim Wheaton. This is not Tim Fountain, not the one with the dog outside of the shop. Tim Wheaton is a close friend of Charles's since 2001. He tells detectives that Charles spoke to him about fights that he would have with his wife, Rachael Anderson. In particular, He remembers a fight in November or December of 2009 where Charles told him that he got physically violent with Rachael. That connects Charles to at least having the ability and the intention of harming Rachael. This is not long before she disappeared. Tim also says he knows about the bad texting and voice messages, including that Charles told him that even his pastor had counseled him to stop texting and contacting Rachael. Can a pastor testify in court? I should look that up. I wonder if confessions in church are confidential. Statements made to a minister, priest, rabbi, or other religious leader are generally considered privileged or confidential communications. State laws generally exempt a pastor from having to testify in court or to law enforcement about what was discussed in a church confession. One Times said that in early February, Charles had been in a tirade about the relationship with Rachael, and he wanted the marriage to continue. But he also admitted that he borrowed cars from his customers at his auto shop in Moscow, Idaho, and he would drive around Rachael's house in Clarkston, Washington, to check up on her activities. He also said he had a friend who lived near Rachael, and he would have his friend drive by Rachael's house to check on her. So, Bert was right, that's stalking behavior for sure. But who's this friend? I see why detectives' jobs take so long, because every time they interview someone, they get more information, and then they have to follow up on that. So before they locate this other friend, Tim drops a bombshell. He says that in February, Charles told him, in reference to Rachael, that he could kill her and bury her body, and no one would ever find it. Okay, that's a little crazy. Like, that's kind of dumb. Are criminals that dumb? Why would you tell somebody that if it's even true? But why would this guy Tim lie? Apparently, Charles also told him that his business wasn't doing well and that he was about $250,000 to $300,000 in the hole. Tim also said Charles used to stalk and harass his prior wives and a prior girlfriend, and he had a drinking problem. When he drank, he became vicious and mean, and we know he was drinking the night Rachael went missing, and that was by his own admission. This is a lot to take in. They want to track down this friend who supposedly helped Charles keep tabs on Rachael. So, they go back through his cell phone data and all of his text messages, and they locate a guy named Nathan D. Donner. He was in contact with Nathan in the recent weeks leading up to Rachael's disappearance. It really seems like he's going to the extreme, even having other people check up on her. What's his motive? Captain Halley brings Nathan in for an interview. He says, "We know that you've been talking to Charles, and you've been providing information about Rachael and what she's been doing." So, we asked Nathan how long he had known Charles, how he met him, and he told them that they met back in 2006 when he used to be a FedEx driver that delivered to Charles's repair shop. It was interesting because when the detective asked him how long he knew Rachael, or how he knew Rachael, he said that he had known her since high school, and that he was the one who introduced Rachael and Charles. And that is heartbreaking if it turned out that Rachael was not alive, and it was because of Charles. Just to think that you were the one who connected those two. He said that he and Charles were out at dinner one night and they decided to go to a bar. That was when they saw Rachael leaving. Nathan recognized her and said, "Hey, how are you?" Then he introduced them to one another, and later he finds out they got married. Holly goes on to ask if Nathan knew whether or not they had any problems in their relationship, and he told them they had their spats. The detective wants to know, what do you mean? Well, Nathan says that Charles had a Vogue magazine in his shop. You know, when women customers come in, they're waiting for their car, they're going through the Vogue magazine. Rachael apparently told him to get rid of those kinds of magazines because she thought that they were sleazy and demeaning. He said that Rachael would actually hit Charles if he looked at other women. So of course, the detective wants to know, have you ever seen this? Have you ever seen Rachael actually hit Charles? And he says, no, I'm just basing this off of what Charles told me. As far as he was concerned, anytime he saw the couple together, they were all over each other, like loving each other. But as for the stalking, the detective wants to know if Charles ever asked Nathan to drive over to Rachael's to keep an eye on her. Nathan tells him that Charles had said he wondered what Rachael was up to, and he did say that, hey, if you're going to go past there, Let me know if she's with anyone. Let me know what cars are out there. But he said he wasn't necessarily going by there for Charles. He had to go past Rachel's house because he was dating a girl who lived close by. He had to pass Rachel's to get there. But Charles had asked him just to keep an eye out, see if there were a bunch of other rigs at her house. But why would there be a bunch of rigs? We now understand rigs means vehicles. Why would there be a whole bunch of vehicles at her house? Did he mean other men, more than one? He just sounds kind of unstable. If Rachael wanted him to know her business, she would have made him a part of it. Nathan said on several occasions, Charles did ask him to go by there and tell him what vehicles were present. He wouldn't exactly report back to him, but if Charles called back to check, he would let him know. They want to know how many times, and he said maybe 4 times in the last few months. Finally, the detective asked some final questions if Charles ever talked about Rachael, and Nathan said Charles would say stuff about Rachael all the time, about how she ignored him, about how he was paying her bills. Finally, he gave him some advice. You know what? Just wash your hands of Rachael. She's the one that kicked you out. Move on. Nathan believed Charles was still in love with Rachael. He said he knew Charles loved her. He was always talking to his pastor about how to get her back and get her into counseling. But Nathan said it just got to a point where he didn't want to hear about it anymore. He got sick of it, and he would just change the subject if it got brought up. Still sifting through the messages and the calls, the day that Rachael went missing, detectives find a call from Charles to someone named Alyssa Stone. And this is around 1:30 p.m. That's around the same time that Charles had texted Bert about the opening that he may have at his job. So they track down Alyssa Stone, and she tells them that she's the wife of David Christopher Stone, one of Charles's longtime friends. David's a high school baseball coach. He's a volunteer firefighter for the Moscow Fire Department. He's a wonderful stepfather and a family man. He wasn't just friends with Charles. Rachel's daughter, Amber, tells detectives that David was also Rachel's friend, and she referred to him as Stoney. She had only good things to say about David. Many of the detectives knew David and his wife, Alyssa. He worked at the Moscow City Maintenance Center, and Alyssa worked at Moscow City Hall as a grants writer. Detectives want to know why Charles made a phone call to David's wife on the 16th, and she tells them it was in regard to working on her car. David would work on cars with Charles, so that afternoon, David left to go work on her car at Charles's shop. They asked if she spoke to her husband David again that day, and she says, yeah, around 3 o'clock. She called David, and he told her he hadn't even started to work on their car yet. Then again, at 6 p.m., she calls David again, tells him dinner's ready, and he told her, you know what? Rachael showed up and she was not happy that her car wasn't ready. So David says, you know what? I'm going to stay here with Charles and hopefully be able to work on your car. But Charles was pretty upset. Then at 7 p.m., David called Alyssa and said that someone was delivering a car part for her car, and he was going to stay and put it on. He would be home later. At 8 p.m., David called his wife Alyssa again and said, oh, the wrong part was delivered for your car. So Alyssa asked David if he had eaten, and he said, oh, I went and got something from the A&W for me and Charles. This is great information. Detectives are hoping that David can answer some very important questions. It seems like they found the man who Charles referred to as his ace. According to what David's wife Alyssa showed them, it appeared as though David was the one at the shop that night with him. Alyssa goes on to say that between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m., David actually shows up at their house, and he's driving Charles's truck. Alyssa said that David told her, I just dropped Charles off at Mingle's, which was a bar, and I'm going to go back and pick him up so he doesn't have to drive under the influence. Not too long later, David told Alyssa he would be right back, that Rachael had come back over after computer shopping and her car still wasn't done, and she was mad. He then again went on to explain that Charles was pretty upset because Rachael was depressed, and she wanted him to do a lot of things he couldn't do, like pay her bills. This is all very interesting, but the story isn't the same as the one Charles told detectives. They are hearing it from a third party, Alyssa, and not David himself, so they needed to track him down for an interview. When detectives meet with David, he confirms the information that Charles already gave to police. He tells them, "Sure, Rachel stopped by the shop. It was Friday evening. She wanted to switch cars, and the work was not done, and I was having work done on Alyssa's vehicle that afternoon." But if David was truly with Charles, why didn't Charles just tell police right away? David also confirms that he brought Charles over to this bar. He had a few drinks with him in between fixing Rachel's car that night, but Charles had never mentioned this bar either. If David's telling the truth, though, it would be very easy to figure it out because Mingles had surveillance cameras. The detectives pulled the footage, and guess what? They don't see David, and they don't see Charles. David has an explanation. He's like, "You know what? I didn't go inside." But they're like, "But there's no sign of Charles either." Because Charles and David seem to have very different accounts of the night, their calls and texts didn't match up, and the timeline seemed off. It really raised suspicion into both of these men. Something wasn't adding up, and they just could not put a finger on it. But speaking of fingers, remember the tip of the glove in the Yukon? They finally did a DNA test. It contained both Rachel and Charles's skin cell DNA. It was also determined that Rachel's blood was on the piece of paper that was found on the floor and inside her purse. However, it was such a very small amount that it wasn't enough for Charles Capone to be charged with murder. But they weren't going to give up. They weren't going to let this case go cold, but that's not what the public believed. The authorities were not giving out any information. The news was scarce. Police wouldn't tell the public what they found inside the repair shop or why Rachel was even there. The community was left in the dark. Where was Rachael Anderson? The frustration was apparent by the posts on the Facebook page that Rachel's family made. Everyone was trying to help. They were offering tips and theories. They would say things like, "Did you get EquuSearch to come out?" Or, "Nancy Grace talk about the case to make it more public." But police assured them they were working hard. They just didn't want to compromise the case by exposing the evidence that they had. Even Charles's arrest was being downplayed by the police. They said, "Oh yeah, he got arrested, but it was unrelated." But it seemed too coincidental that Rachel's missing and her estranged husband is arrested on a weapons charge. It seems related to me, wouldn't it to you? Charles did end up pleading guilty to that firearm charge, and he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. Amber admitted that when her mom first started dating Charles, there was just something about him she did not like. She pulled her mom aside and said, "Listen, Mom, he seems like he's hiding something." Now the family thinks he's hiding Rachel. They're worried sick because if their mother is still alive and she's locked up somewhere, and he's the only one that knows where she is, and now he's in prison, they think she could die. They want them to hurry up and solve this case. However, the police have a plan. When they were searching the shop, they found these pictures of Charles. He was posing with guns. He was acting like a tough guy. He thought he was a tough guy because, as far as he was concerned, he believed that he was actually a relative of Al Capone. His last name gave him a sense of power. However, there's no relation that they could find between Charles Capone and Al Capone, even though they shared the same last name. Detectives believe that Charles will talk in prison, and they hope he does. They think it's only a matter of time. Meanwhile, they're still compiling as much evidence as possible. Here are some of the relevant findings. The mileage on Rachel's Stratus was checked against the work order. There were 140 to about 150 unaccounted for miles on that car. Alyssa Stone was re-interviewed, and she mentioned that Charles had actually borrowed her Dodge Durango to move out of the Bogdan's residence on Tuesday, April 20th, the day after Rachel was reported missing. She said when Charles got back, she was so upset because he had used all of her gas and she had just filled up the tank. Not to mention, there were at least 7 major inconsistencies in David's timeline of events for the night that Rachel was last seen. By his and Charles's own admissions, they were the last people to see her that night. Alyssa stated that David left to go to Charles's shop at 1:30 p.m., but David said he went to the shop around 4 or 4:30, so where was he all of those hours? Alyssa said David called her from the shop around 3 p.m. and told her he hadn't even started working on the car yet. Phone records show David called the shop several times during the time he said he was at the shop. So which one was it? Well, David said no. I was at the shop. Charles was wearing an earpiece while he was working on a car, and I was just calling him. I was sitting right there. I just wanted to mess with him. Are you sure you weren't planning what you were going to do that night? David said he went to A&W around 7 p.m., and that he also went on the store side to buy some candy, and he went through the front doors. Well, when they pulled up the video, he didn't go through the front door. So he's like, maybe I didn't, and maybe I didn't buy candy. So, which one is it? David said Rachael and the Yukon were gone when he got back from getting food shortly after 7 p.m. Rachel's phone records show something else. She made a call from the shop to her ex-husband Dennis at 8:09. So, her car couldn't have been gone because she was in that area. Remember that David said O'Reilly's delivered a part for the Durango, but told his wife it was the wrong part? Well, the part was actually delivered for Rachel's car. When they asked, was the part delivered before you went for food or after, David tried to look at the timeline to figure it out instead of using his brain from his memory. At that point, getting flustered, he said, "You know what? I think I might have been in the bathroom when the parts were delivered." David also said he dropped Charles off at Mingle's bar around 9:30 p.m. and picked him up at 10 p.m. But when they told him, "You know what? Charles never went inside," David said, "Oh well, I didn't watch him go in. I just dropped him outside, so maybe, I don't know." David said when he returned to Mingle's, he called Charles on the phone to pick him up. When David is told that there's no record of this call, David said that maybe Charles was just standing outside and he came by and he was waiting for him. Well, Scott Galena, who was representing Rachael in her divorce, confirms that as of April 12, 2010, just a few days before she went missing, enough time had finally passed so that the divorce could be finalized. He said that a date had not been set, but that Charles had been increasingly insistent that they were going to make a reconciliation, and he wasn't going to sign those papers. Rachael had also told her friend, Jennifer, that Charles had given her a 3-day ultimatum concerning their relationship. The ultimatum was that Rachael had to give Charles an answer by Friday, the 16th, whether or not they were going to work on their marriage. Rachael had already told Jennifer she was going to tell Charles that night that the relationship was over. Well, there you go. Don't you think that this is the reason why all of this happened? If he couldn't have her, nobody could. Detectives found a receipt in the white Dodge Durango, and it belonged to Charles. It was parked on the side of the shop, and that receipt was from Spence Hardware. It was for a brown and green tarp purchased on the 17th. That's the day after Rachael went missing. So, the detectives tracked down some people who work at the shop, and they told detectives that there had been an old green and brown tarp, just like the new one, but it had all this paint spray on it, just like that other one that was there. But all of a sudden, on the 17th, it was replaced with a brand new tarp. Where do you think the old tarp is, and what was it used for? Time is going by. Detectives know that Charles is going to be let out of prison soon, and they know he's a danger to society. They didn't want this man to walk free. Their job was to convince the Loudoun County prosecutor to take on Rachel's case as a murder case. Based on all the evidence and information gathered to date, the detectives believed David Stone and Charles Capone were involved in Rachel's disappearance, her murder, and the disposal of her remains. At this time, law enforcement officers from multiple jurisdictions are involved, which included the Lakeside County Sheriff's Office, the Moscow Police Department, the Acetone County Sheriff's Office, the Clarkson Police Department, the Lewiston Police Department, and the Idaho State Police. They are all involved, and together, they're trying to figure out how they can get more information from David Stone. Maybe somehow they can get him to admit where the body is, if there is a body. So, while Charles is currently incarcerated in the top federal prison in California, David would get a letter. This is what the police planned, and it was supposed to be from Charles within prison. The letter would simply state, "I need you to check on our friend. I think someone has disturbed her." They were hoping this would make David go to the body. Immediately after the letter is mailed, they placed GPS tracking devices on all 3 of David's vehicles, and they watched and waited. They tracked, but David did not go anywhere except his usual locations. However, one location that David drove to did lead them to their very next clue. It was the Moscow City Maintenance Center, where David worked. Detectives decided to ask David's co-workers if anything seemed out of the ordinary about him in the weeks before or after Rachael went missing. A co-worker came forward and told them that just a week prior to Rachael's disappearance, David, out of the blue, wanted to know how to operate a backhoe. He told his co-workers he was going to help a buddy with a project over the weekend. David was taught how to run a backhoe. What project is he referring to? Look at this thing. It doesn't exactly look like it's used to repair cars, does it? Burying a body? Definitely possible. David practiced with the backhoe. He dug a large hole in an area near the spoils pile. This is where the street sweepers dump all of their debris. David left this large gaping hole uncovered, even though he was instructed to fill it back in. David also made a statement to a coworker that he was angry with. He told that coworker if he didn't stop, he was going to bury them in the spoils pile. After that, David never expressed any interest in the backhoe again. Not only that, another coworker had something even more incriminating to tell detectives, but it's not about Rachael. It's in regard to another woman who may still be in danger. Christopher Porter came forward and alleged that in November or December of 2009, the same time that allegedly Charles had a physical fight with Rachael, remember that? He said that David asked him if he would kill his wife Alyssa for $10,000. Seriously? David informed Christopher that his wife Alyssa Stone had a very large life insurance policy. He also told Christopher that he would give him a 9mm gun to do it. Of course, Christopher said no, and then he tells him David reaches back out. He says, "You know what? Your services are no longer needed. Me and my buddy Charles, we came up with a plan to kill each other's wives." This could not be real. Can you imagine a person just casually talking about this like it's an everyday thing? It's evil. It's absolutely sickening if it's true. A man like David, working as a volunteer firefighter, trying to save people's lives, but also allegedly planning to kill his own wife. So, of course, detectives tell Alyssa she may be next, and she decides to stay with her husband. He convinced her that the detectives and the police just made the story up to put pressure on him, hoping that he would turn against Charles. But David's not the only one talking. As expected, cool guy Charles Capone confided in an inmate that it was him who was making all those calls and those texts to Rachael, pretending that he was being harassed and that he was using that app to disguise his voice and his number. I want to tell you that this is an actual manipulation technique that is used by stalkers. They try to come to their victims' defense as heroes, but they're the ones that should be feared. Wait, because it gets more insane. This inmate builds rapport with Charles, but he's really turned into an informant, and he was instructed to ask Charles the best way to get rid of the body so it would never be found. Charles actually tells him how he would do it if he did kill someone. He says this,
saying he would put them on a tarp, then cut them up and dissolve the body in a car parts washer. Investigators say he had that parts washer in his Moscow shop.
A tarp, cut the body up, and then use a car parts washer. The detectives pay Charles a visit, and they blatantly say to him, "Charles, today you're going to tell us that you killed Rachael and where her body is." Charles answered with, "Well, you got one of those things right, but I didn't kill her. So who did?" Now they're putting pressure on David Stone, telling him, "We know you have blood on your hands." All David says is, "I think I need to get a glass of water." But he never denied it. But things like his phone records seem to speak for themselves. Between the hours of 8:40 p.m. on April 16th until 8:52 the morning after, that's a time between Rachael being last seen until the next day, 12 hours and 12 minutes are unaccounted for. No activity was on David's phone, and Charles had no activity between 7:30 p.m. on the 16th until 9:57 p.m. Rachael's phone had no activity between 8:27 p.m. and 9:20 p.m. on the very same night. Very fishy. All three phones have no activity between those times. It's a little bit weird with David's being off the longest. 3 years had gone by. It was 2013. The police believed they had enough information and evidence to bring this case to the district attorney and charge both David and Charles with murder. The district attorney at that time is the very same one that's prosecuting the University of Idaho case against Brian Christopher Kohberger, none other than Lada County prosecutor Bill Thompson. The longtime Lada County prosecuting attorney received his Juris Doctor from the University of Idaho. He has strong ties to his community, especially when it comes to 4 students who were slain in his county who went to his alumni university. When presented with all the facts of Rachael's case, here's what he had to say to the media. Voice 6.
We felt it was time to proceed with charges. We're finally at the culmination of 3 years of investigation, 3 years of information gathering that put us in the position where we thought we had a sufficient basis to proceed and that it was time to move forward and try to get some closure, try to get some accountability.
Now let's listen in on the prosecution's theory of what happened to Rachael and why. Voice 7.
Court papers indicate Stone was also at the shop and lied to investigators to cover Capone's tracks. Investigators say the pair also talked about killing each other's wives.
Here's the promise that Bill Thompson made to the public. Voice 8.
We will absolutely continue searching for Rachael. That's one of the most important goals that we hope to have from this case.
He promised he would continue to search for Rachael's body. But even without her body, they believed they had a very strong case, especially since after David was arrested, they got a sample of his DNA, and it matched the DNA found on that same black latex glove tip they found in the Yukon. So all 3, David's, Charles's, and Rachael's DNA, was on the tip of that glove. The probable cause affidavit in this case was very extensive. I know that the current one that's being talked about in the Idaho case has been said to be very detailed, but the one in Rachael's case was also very thorough. Even though there's only 12 pages in this one compared to the 18-page one that was recently released, in reference to the arrest of Brian Kohberger, look at the one for Charles and David. Page after page of evidence, all of which I've brought to you in this video. Even though the media stopped talking about Rachael's case, Detective Nichols never gave up the search for Rachael. Even on her days off, she would scour wheat fields, wells, and abandoned buildings, all looking for clues. She even consulted with psychics to use their visions and dreams to try to locate Rachael. Amber even allowed a hypnotist to hypnotize her and tried to communicate with her mom, hoping that Rachael could tell her family where she was. But none of that worked. Something else wasn't going well. Remember the co-worker of David Stone, Christopher Porter? Well, he would not appear in court. They subpoenaed him multiple times, and he refused to testify about what David had allegedly told him regarding Charles and him planning to kill each other's wives. He told the detectives he knew nothing about the case. So now they only had circumstantial evidence to present to the jury. Nobody but the prosecution still believed they had a strong case. At the preliminary hearing, all of this evidence was set up in detail with additional findings as well. Here are all the pieces of evidence they presented. This went on for several days. That's when Alyssa Stone finally became convinced that her husband David truly wanted her dead. It was devastating. She immediately filed for divorce, but David insisted he was not a monster. A motion from the defense was granted to seal documents to ensure that David and Charles would have a fair trial. The same was asked in the Idaho case. A lot of what they wanted sealed actually pertained to the expenses going towards Charles's defense. DNA experts, investigators. It was an intense task. There were approximately 3,800 pages of documents, 120,000 lines of cell phone records, 8,500 lines of GPS data, 30 hours of recorded interviews, 1,700 photos, and more. It's costly. DNA tests per sample are $1,195 each, and the consultation fee for a DNA expert is $1,475, plus $295 per hour for testimony. And that's just for one expert. The defense requested many experts, DNA experts, pharmaceutical experts, blood detection specialists, and here are what those experts' fees are. A blood detection expert is $1,200 just for the retainer to start. The scent dog expert was $3,000 for a retainer alone. They initially approved $30,000 for the defense experts, but requests can be made for an increase, and there were requests for increases. The trial date was set for December 2013, but just days before the trial was set to begin, David Stone wanted to talk to detectives. His story was about to change. he wanted a plea deal. If he agreed to tell them what really happened, he wanted immunity for the murder charge, and they agreed. It's a smart move because remember, they only have circumstantial evidence, and it looks as though Charles is mounting an intense defense against these charges. David agrees to plead guilty to the charge of failure to notify law enforcement or the coroner of a death, in exchange for his truthful testimony against Charles Capone. So what is it that David said really happened? Well, he said his decision to testify against Charles started when Charles whispered something in his ear during the preliminary hearing. And what was that exactly? David said Charles whispered, "You shouldn't even be here." David decided he wasn't going to take the fall for Charles. His pastor was the one that ultimately convinced him to tell the truth. His version of that night was that he came over to help Charles work on his wife Alyssa's car, the Dodge Durango. While he was inside the garage, he heard a loud thud. He looked outside and saw a struggle. He went towards the back of Rachel's vehicle, and that's when he saw Charles on top of her, strangling her. Rachel was barely moving. David shouted, "What the fuck are you doing?" He said that Charles turned around, looked straight at him, and had what he described as the look of Satan on his face. He told David to shut the f up, to get a hold of himself, that he was in this with him now, and he knew where his family was. They asked him why he didn't intervene, and he said it was out of fear. He just saw a man kill his own wife. He didn't know what Charles was capable of doing to him. So, he helped move Rachel's body inside the shop, and then they brought the Yukon to the bus station close to Rachel's house and returned to the shop. Then they wrapped up Rachel's body in a tarp, laid her down over the chains, rolled her up in the chains, and placed her inside the Dodge. They drove it out to a bridge over the Snake River, and Charles told him when to stop the vehicle. They got out, opened up the back hatch, pulled Rachel out, and dumped her over the side. During the trial, the defense attorney's strategy was to discredit David Stone, create reasonable doubt about the state's evidence, and offer alternate suspects. One of those people was a name we're familiar with from the beginning of the case: William Slump, the once obsessed boyfriend that wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, it turns out he's the perfect fall guy. Why? Because he was dead. He died before the case went to trial. Did he take secrets with him to his grave? Was he Rachel's real killer? The defense says so. They introduced evidence of a restraining order that Rachel filed against him, as well as testimony from Rachel's own daughter Amber, saying that Rachel thought he was the one who vandalized her vehicle. The defense also called Detective Jackie Nichols to the stand to confirm that those letters William kept sending to Rachel did exist. But what the defense argued didn't exist was what the cops never found during their investigation. They attacked the lack of evidence of a crime. There was no physical evidence inside that repair shop, no signs of a struggle, and there were no fingerprints of Charles in the Yukon. However, there was a set of fingerprints that didn't match any known suspects. The defense cross-examined David for an entire day. One question they had was, if he wasn't your friend, and instead it was a guy you thought was trying to harm you or you were fearful of, why did you guys still hang out? Why did you stay in contact? Why were you acting like his buddy? His response was that he would rather know where the person was that may harm him for safety reasons. But the fact is, David Stone lied to the police for 3.5 years, so why should anyone trust him now? After 7 days, Prosecutor Bill Thompson had the final word to the jury. He said, "Rachel's gone forever." He ensured, pointing to Charles Capone, that her body, her physical essence, was also gone forever. But we can't let that allow him to escape responsibility, essentially saying, just because he's good at hiding or getting rid of a body, don't let that be the reason he gets away with this. But Charles has always maintained his innocence, saying that he's done bad things in the past he's not proud of, but killing Rachel isn't one of them. He doesn't have it in him. He's not a sociopath. He's just like most men. He just makes poor decisions. Okay then. Rachel's loved ones had waited 4.5 years to hear the verdict in this case, and it was time. They held their breath as they waited for the clerk to read off, guilty or not guilty. And the verdict was guilty. Amber said it was a bittersweet moment. She wasn't getting her mother back. All it was doing was protecting other women and children from being harmed by Charles Capone. Rachael's family was allowed to give victim impact statements. Ashley, Rachael's other daughter, said, "We live in pain every day because of what Charles did. Every one of us." Charles finally spoke when he declared he did not murder Rachael and that the court had erred in convicting him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but he announced at the time that he intended to appeal immediately. There were a number of search operations that were conducted after David confessed to where they threw Rachael's body over the Snake River, but those searches have never turned up any sign of Rachael. As of July 2016, David Stone has actually been released on parole after serving just 3 years. The good news is, Idaho's Supreme Court did Charles Capone's request for a new trial in 2018. Also in 2018, prosecuting attorney Bill Thompson was interviewed by the Lewis interview Craig Clohessy. He asked him, "You've been the Latta County prosecutor for about 26 years. Is there a case that stands out for you?" Bill Thompson said, "We've had a number of remarkable, challenging cases. I think the one that probably currently stands out most is the Charles Capone murder trial, the murder of Rachael Anderson, where her body has never been recovered. But we were able to obtain a conviction, an appropriate conviction, and an appropriate sentence." He said this 4 years before he knew what tragedy would befall Kaylee, Maddie, Ethan, and Xana in the fall of 2022. Now I think the one that probably stands out to him is the one that he has currently been tasked to undertake, and I honestly know that he's the right man for this job, to prosecute whoever is responsible for killing these 4 beautiful, talented, innocent, young University of Idaho students. I know that justice will be done, and I'm so sorry to Rachael's family and to the family of Kaylee, Maddie, Ethan, and Xana. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to happen to the people that you love. I'm sorry. Halloween is meant to be a time to gather with friends and enjoy some playful festivities. You might dress up as a lovely girl, a mischievous character, or a cheerful persona. It's not something you'd expect to encounter a real-life monster. Now, on to the story for today. Chelsea Allen Bruck was born January 28, 1992, in Trenton, Michigan, to her mother Leonda and her father Matthew Bruck. Leonda was a banker, and Chelsea's father Matt was a farmer. Chelsea was the youngest of 5 children. She had 3 sisters, Jennifer, Cassandra, and Megan, and a brother Nathaniel. She was very close to her sister Cassandra because she was only 2 years older than her. But all of the Bruck siblings were very close. Chelsea loved being one of the Bruck girls. They all grew up on a family farm in a very small town called Maybe, and the community had an estimated population of only 556 people. It's another small town case for today. This could actually be the smallest town that I have talked about so far. It's actually called the Village of Maybe in Exeter Township. I wondered what the brown jug was because that was predominantly displayed on Google Maps. Well, it's literally just a bar and grill. It's nothing fancy at all, but for this tiny village, it was most likely the spot. They're proudly serving flatbread pizza. Just like in most of these small towns, I see a cemetery, a post office, a Dollar General, and they're even showcasing their water tower on Google Maps. The water tower, those are the most important places to be seen on this bird's eye view. Other than that, there's just a lot of green on this map, but there is something charming about this town though. Look at that little post office. I bet there is never a line in there, not like the ones here in LA. If you have to mail something out, yeah, it's gonna take you all day. You're gonna have to take a day off just to get something mailed out in LA. But here in the Village of Maybe, it's so cozy it doesn't even look real. It looks like a little town in Beetlejuice. I mean, that exact post office does not look real to me, but it really is. And this is where Chelsea grew up, surrounded by a community that knew each other. They attended church regularly, and she was brought up with certain morals and values and a certain lifestyle. There's just so much of the world that she hadn't seen yet. The Bruck's house was a 4th-generation farmhouse. Matt and Leonda were raising their son and their 4 daughters on a 160-acre farm that was started by Matt's great-grandfather in 1875. Matt and his wife had farmed for years. It was all they knew. It was what they believed in, and it was what they were passing down to their children, just like their family had passed it down to them. Their farm sat on a dirt road just outside of town. The maybe downtown area was just 2 blocks long, that's it. And here's the welcome sign. It says, "Welcome to Maybe, the best little town in Michigan." To get an understanding of Chelsea and her upbringing, I want to tell you where she went to school. She attended St. Patrick's School for Elementary Studies. Their website says it's a Christ-centered, spirit-filled, solid Christian community. Students are immersed in scriptures, and the curriculum is based upon their faith. Students encounter Jesus Christ in every class, every day. Students are taught the Catholic doctrine in an atmosphere that reflects love, care, and respect for the uniqueness of each person. The teachers are dedicated to teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. These values are woven throughout the entire curriculum and acted upon through many opportunities for Christian service. This is what Chelsea was immersed in. This is where Chelsea got her values for community, for others, and the respect for herself. For high school, Chelsea attended Monroe Public High School, which was much bigger, with an emphasis on sports like football, cheerleading, as well as marching band. It seems like a pretty ordinary high school with the usual characteristics and the things that a teen or someone in high school would find to be important and fun, especially during those transformative years of their life. After graduating, Chelsea and her sister Cassandra continued living on the farm with their parents. The other Bruck siblings had already left home, gotten married, or both. Chelsea loved baking, she had a passion for it, and she hoped that one day she could attend culinary school and become a chef. However, she was content finding a secure job close to home at a restaurant called Olga's Kitchen. There, she enjoyed welcoming patrons as a hostess. Chelsea was a good girl growing up, and she evolved into a very innocent, happy, kind, and beautiful woman. Her life was just beginning when tragedy struck. It's so important for me to paint the most accurate picture that I possibly can about who Chelsea was as a person, because it helps to piece together the story later. So remember these details. One thing that I found to be important for me to learn about Chelsea is that she still relied on her parents a lot. By the time she was 22 years old, she didn't even have a driver's license or a car. But she didn't feel like she wanted or needed them, because her parents were more than happy to drive her anywhere that she needed to be, mostly to and from work at Olga's Kitchen. It's a chain restaurant with a Mediterranean menu. They have flatbread sandwiches, salads, and it's in a sleek, bright atmosphere. It kind of reminds me of Chipotle for Mediterranean food. The area that Olga's Kitchen was located in was a little more happening than where Chelsea lived. It was in Monroe County, which is about 15 minutes away from the farm. This area had all of the fun fast food places, shopping like the Mall of Monroe, movie theaters, Walmart, things like that. So it was bound to open her up to more about life, and especially new people. As a matter of fact, by the time she was 22, Chelsea's closest friends were the ones that she met while she was working the past 4 years at Olga's. They hung out all the time and were very close. 3 of those friends were Becky Brunson, Heather Brooks, and Laura Taylor. Being friends with a girl like Chelsea meant that you had someone to watch movies with, especially musicals. She loved musicals. Being around Chelsea meant listening to music. One band in particular, Queen, was her favorite band. She loved playing video games, including Final Fantasy, and her favorite TV show was also one of mine, Doctor Who. Chelsea also enjoyed reading and loving on her cat and her dog. She just sounds like such a sweet person, and she really was. Actually, many of the people that knew her said that they loved being around her because of her positive outlook on life. She had a fun side too, though. Not rebellious in any way, but fun. She liked putting pink streaks in her blonde hair and getting a small anchor tattooed on her neck behind her ear. But why would a small-town girl get something nautical like an anchor? She's 5 feet 7 inches, she's got green eyes, short, straight blonde hair, and a beautiful smile. Chelsea really enjoyed socializing. She liked going to parties. There was one party that the girls were really looking forward to. They had been literally talking about it and planning it all summer long. It was an annual Halloween party hosted by the lead singer of a Detroit rock band. His name is Mike Williams, but most people know him as Big Mike Pickaxe Preacher. That's his band, and the music is described as aggressive, in-your-face thrash music. The 31-year-old lead singer from Frenchtown Township had been throwing these annual Halloween bashes since he was in high school. Because of his band's presence in Michigan and beyond, the parties were more like concerts, and they had grown from little house parties to full-on events, entertaining upward of 800 to 1,000 people from all over the state and even neighboring states. In 2014, Mike was planning his biggest party yet. It was being held at his mother's farmland out in Newport Township, Michigan, which is about 15 minutes away from Olga's kitchen and about a 30-minute drive from the town of Maybe. This was the event of the year. It was also the 10th anniversary, so it was going to have it all. There were about 8 to 10 bands that were going to be playing, so at least 10 hours of live musical entertainment, lots of fun new people to meet, a costume party, and more. Chelsea loved being creative. She didn't just want to dress up, she wanted to dress up to win the costume contest. Chelsea and her friends had actually attended 2 of Mike's previous Halloween parties, and they loved it, so they pretty much knew what to expect and were looking forward to it so much. Becky and Chelsea decided that they were going to go as Batman villains. Chelsea chose the beautiful Poison Ivy, a character from the DC Comics who was played by Uma Thurman in the Batman and Robin movie. Here are some photos. It kind of speaks for itself. When you hear Poison Ivy, you kind of know you're going to have ivy covered all over the body. Chelsea was making a costume that emulates that look. Chelsea had the idea to take an ordinary green leotard and turn it into an ivy-covered one-piece. Instead of buying something, Chelsea painstakingly sewed her own creation. One by one, she hand-sewed each piece of fake ivy onto her leotard. She took pictures of her handiwork and shared them with friends along the way. Almost every night after work, Chelsea would sit in front of the TV and sew until she got tired and went to bed. This outfit was 6 weeks in the making, and when it was finally done, it was awesome. It was like a high-quality piece, something that you would probably find on a place like Etsy. Totally handmade, and it looked awesome on Chelsea. She decided she would wear it over a pair of green leggings, and she wanted to wear red shoes, but they were definitely going to have to be flats because there was going to be a lot of dirt, grass, and cornfields to walk through. That is no place for heels. Chelsea got a glass jug, and she labeled it Poison. This is what she planned to bring her red wine in. It was a practical prop. She didn't have to carry around a cup, and instead, she would drink right out of her own poison bottle and stay in character all night long. She might even win a prize for the most creative outfit. There was so much to look forward to, and before the girls knew it, the night was finally there. Saturday, October 25th, 2014. Laura planned to drive. Chelsea didn't plan on going all the way back home that night since she didn't drive, so she planned on spending the night with a friend. She packed an overnight bag and brought it with her into Laura's car, along with a small change purse, and of course, her cell phone. The girls arrived at the party at approximately 10 p.m., which is fairly early. But even by then, there were hundreds of people there. As they pulled up, everything was so organized. There was a dedicated parking lot, security guards guiding traffic, and directing people to 2 large tents that had been set up. There were a bunch of food trucks, bars, porta potties, fire twirling, a 40-foot bonfire, and prizes for the best costume. Of course, there was a stage, and among the bands were Psychopathic Days, Armageddon Awaits, and Everything Must Die. Mike seemed to have thought of everything, and the excitement was palpable. After parking, the girls made their way to the excitement. That's when Chelsea had to make a decision, to bring or not to bring her phone with her. Poison Ivy didn't exactly need pockets, so her outfit didn't have them. She was already holding a large glass jug and was with friends who had their phones, so she opted out of taking hers. She left it behind with her belongings in Laura's vehicle, and they proceeded to make their way to the party. As you can probably imagine, it was organized chaos. Apparently, someone had taken it upon themselves to post this invitation publicly on Facebook, and it pretty much went viral. Mike was not expecting this many people to show up, but the more, the merrier. After all, it was more exposure for his band, and the music was the main attraction. Mike's band was on stage, dressed as Ninja Turtles, and hundreds of people were there drinking, smoking, and doing drugs. Nothing was off limits when you were in disguise. You could hardly tell who anyone was. But the girls did know about 15 to 20 people that were attending that night. The fun began as soon as they walked up. The music, the decorations, the costumes. There were other things about the night that kind of went unnoticed, though. It was pitch black outside those lighted tents. There was land as far as the eye could see, and even beyond. Anyone could get lost out there. By midnight, there were close to 1,000 people coming and going. Strangers were everywhere. The girls were definitely having the time of their lives, and Chelsea was pretty intoxicated, which was to be expected. She met up with another friend, Penny Renee Watkins, as well as Penny's sister and another girl named Heather Brooks. Becky was there too. Penny and Chelsea were very good friends. They were attached at the hip the entire party. Even though Penny was a decade older than Chelsea and had kids of her own, she felt like, when she was with Chelsea, she could let loose and be goofy. They acted like little schoolgirls. Here's a picture of Chelsea with Penny and some other friends at the party that night. They looked so happy. But around 12:45, as she and Penny were making their way to a huge bonfire that had flames 15 to 20 feet in the air, with tons of people gathered around in front of it, something happened to Chelsea that she wasn't expecting. Chelsea let out a subtle scream, holding her face in pain. Poor Chelsea had run into a wooden post face first. She ended up getting a gash on her forehead and the bridge of her nose. It was pretty bad. She was bleeding. She was in shock and wanted to leave. Penny, being motherly, calmed her down and persuaded her to stay. "It's going to be fine. It's going to be okay. We'll just have a drink, and then we'll go in a little bit," she said. Chelsea kind of had no choice. She couldn't leave since she was relying on someone else for a ride. Chelsea had a drink, and so did Penny. During that time, they became separated. Penny was riding with her sister, who had to go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, so she had to leave. She couldn't reach out to Chelsea to give her a heads up because she didn't have her phone. She thought it was fine. She knew Chelsea was getting a ride from Laura, so she left. Speaking of which, Chelsea wanted to check in with Laura. They had also been separated in the crowd, and she wanted to see where she was and when they could leave. Chelsea was walking around asking random strangers if she could use their phone to call her friend. Finally, some guy saw her crying and let her use his phone. Apparently, Laura had looked for Chelsea and couldn't find her either. She couldn't reach her since Laura had Chelsea's phone with her, so she went looking and found Becky. She told Becky, "Look, I've got to go, but I have all of Chelsea's things, including her phone. Can you take it with you? Then when you see her, can you give them to her?" Becky said sure. Now Becky was roaming around in a sea of people, over all the noise and commotion, trying to locate Chelsea, but she couldn't find her either. Chelsea was continuing to search for her friends, or actually for anyone she knew who could possibly give her a ride home. Now completely separated from all of her friends, she was frantically asking different strangers if she could use their phone to figure out what to do and how to make it back home that night. That must have been rough. It's hard enough to organize a plan when you're sober, but now intoxicated, alone, and surrounded by hundreds of other intoxicated people, Chelsea finally made her way to the parking area and searched for anyone she knew who could help her out. Becky had already left at this point with all of Chelsea's things, including her cell phone. "I can't be without my phone. It's like my lifeline," she thought. There was just this helpless feeling of not having a connection to people, or GPS or anything. Around 2:45 in the morning, Chelsea was out by a gravel road near the parking area looking for people that were leaving. She was trying to see if she could hitch a ride with someone, waving at people as they were driving up to pick up other people or walking to their cars. There had to be someone willing to help her. The girls had attended Mike's parties before. They were always safe. No one was worried. Laura and Becky knew that a ton of their other friends were at the party, and Chelsea had been hanging out with several of them throughout the night. They were positive that she was going to be just fine. But she wasn't. The day after Mike's party was a Sunday, a day of rest. Everyone that attended was going to need it, and none of the girls in the group made any plans for Sunday because they knew they'd probably be hungover. When Becky was finally up and making it through her day, she called Chelsea's mom to let her know that she had Chelsea's things, including her phone. So, whenever Chelsea wanted to, she could have her mom or dad drive over to retrieve them. Becky didn't get an answer. The call went to voicemail, and she left a message. Then she just went on about her day, trying to nurse her hangover. Becky did not hear back from Chelsea's mom at all, but later that night, she got a Facebook message from Chelsea's older sister, Cassandra. This is when things take a turn for the girls. It's when regret starts to sink in. It's when they begin to question everything, maybe even what kind of friends they are. Cassandra lets Becky know that Chelsea never came home last night, which wasn't that much of a surprise since she'd been planning to stay out. But they still hadn't heard from her, and it was getting late. Becky wasn't worried at first. She sent a message back saying, well, she's probably at a friend's house. Maybe she's just really hungover. You never know, she could have fallen asleep, gotten up for a minute, eaten something, gone back to bed and repeated that. Who knows? But someone does know. Someone knows what happened to Chelsea, but no one close to her does. On Monday morning, when Chelsea didn't show up back at home or even reach out to anyone in her family, they became very concerned. Cassandra and her mom called everyone that knew Chelsea, everyone they knew she would be hanging out with or going to this party with that night, asking if they had any idea where she was. No one knew. She had not gotten into contact with anyone, and this was out of character for Chelsea. The Bruck had the type of family that sat down for dinners every night, and they kept in touch with each other several times throughout the day. On a normal day, they were always in touch with one another. Cassandra and Chelsea were very close, so at this point, they didn't hesitate. They decided to call the Monroe County Sheriff's Department and report Chelsea missing. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office is pretty much between Mabee and Newport, where the party was. So between Chelsea's house and where the Halloween party took place. The party is well known. Even people at the police station know about Big Mike and his parties. So they were gathering all of this information from Chelsea's sister and her mom in order to figure out where the police should start looking and whether or not they should even be concerned. At this point, we're talking about a 22-year-old woman. She's free to do whatever she wants. She doesn't have to have her phone. She doesn't have to use her phone. She doesn't have to call anyone. She could just be at someone's house. Maybe she didn't want to reach out to anyone. Maybe she met someone and was having a fun time. Who knows? But her family knows her well enough to know that this isn't like her. It's the opposite of the character that Chelsea was playing that night. She's not like Poison Ivy. She's quiet, shy, reserved, but most of all, she's responsible. The date is now October 27th, just a few days before Halloween, and this is this family's worst nightmare. Meanwhile, friends are reaching out to Mike via Facebook, asking if he knew anything about Chelsea going missing, or knew anything about Chelsea, or where she was. Anything. And he really didn't know who they were talking about. It's not like he and Chelsea were friends. Yes, she had attended his parties before, but they did not hang out together, and there were literally 1,000 people at his party. Year after year, hundreds and hundreds of people showed up. So no, he had no idea who Chelsea was or where she was. The more time that passed, the more messages Mike was getting. People were even asking him to walk around his mother's farm. I mean, we're talking acres of land, and he was sort of like, what do you want me to be looking for? But I don't think it's that uncalled for. You have individuals who were intoxicated. Would it be that strange if someone passed out in a field? Her friends and family didn't think so. They wanted him to comb that area. So that Monday, he took his dog and went walking. He was pretty much hiking at this point, going through the farm for at least a couple of miles looking around. Meanwhile, guess who's literally meeting up on that property with him? Chelsea's mom and her sister and friends. They actually come to the farm to look for themselves. They were proactive. They were on it from the get-go. They were not going to let a minute go by without doing something to find their loved one. So they just came right onto his property, and Mike really wasn't that happy, and neither was Chelsea's mom, both for different reasons. When Mike was out with his dog ran into a fox trap and was injured very badly. So he is carrying his dog back to the house while Chelsea's mom is coming to the house, trying to look for her daughter. So both of these people are concerned about their children, Mike's fur baby and Leanda's real human child. This interaction wasn't really that great. They were both on edge. Leanda just wants answers. She seems mad at Mike. I mean, after all, yes, it was his party. So is he responsible for her going missing? A lot of people seem to think so. If he wouldn't have had this party, then this wouldn't have happened, right? Another thing Leanda said was that if she had known this was a party with hundreds of people, upward of 800 to 1,000, she wouldn't have let her daughter go. Those were her words. She actually did interviews because the media picked up on this case immediately.
Had I known she was going to a party with over 600 people, 22 or not, she would not have been going.
This small town was rocked by the news. It was huge. Nothing like this had happened before. Chelsea's sister and mom would stop and talk to anyone that would listen. They wanted to get the word out. Mike went and took his dog to the vet, and when he came back to his farm, there were at least 20 people standing at his doorstep, basically asking to search through his fields. He wasn't exactly going to say no, but at the same time, he didn't feel like he'd done anything wrong. He wasn't going to ask Chelsea's family to leave because this was very emotional, and you could tell it was a serious situation, even though the cops weren't there yet. At this moment, he allowed basically anyone onto his property to search. That's going to come later when the police go out there and search. I'll tell you what they used and what they did and what their methods were. But they spent the rest of Monday planning what they were going to do next. Tuesday, the police wanted to talk to anyone who knew Chelsea and anyone they could find that was at this party. And they needed to do it fast. People came into town for this party, and then they went back home, some of them to different states. So they didn't even know if they were going to find anyone who remembered seeing Chelsea. And not only that, we're talking about a Halloween party, and not just a party, a costume party. People were dressed up, they were wearing masks, their identity was disguised. You could have passed by someone you knew and not even known it was them. This was going to be a very difficult investigation for the police. They were hoping that Chelsea would just turn up. By the way, with this many people that detectives had to talk to, it meant they were going to get a lot of information. But not just information, misinformation. Not everyone was going to give them valuable leads. It was going to make the investigators' heads spin. Immediately, as they reached out on places like Facebook, they began to respond to comments that people were making, like saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to attend. You know, when I told you it went viral." Well, they were looking down the comments in these different groups, reaching out to each and every one, asking, "Did you go to the party like you said you were going to in this comment?" Already, the rumors were starting. They were hearing stories and assumptions about what could have happened. One of which was trafficking. Toledo and Detroit are very well known for that type of thing, so it wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility. But why Chelsea? Nobody else seemed to have gone missing, so that didn't really seem like the most valuable lead for them at the moment. But the next unusual tip was that there could have been a satanic ritual going on at this party, and Chelsea could have been burned alive. I know this is outrageous. When a family actually has to hear these things, it can be devastating. It can also be devastating to the investigation because these rumors spread like wildfire. You're definitely going to see that on the news. You're going to see that as a headline because the media loves these stories. Beautiful blonde goes missing at a party after a satanic ritual, when none of that was actually going on. We know this because investigators had to follow up on each and every one of those tips. They can't just let it go because it sounds absurd. Remember, there was a huge bonfire, 15 to 20-foot flames. Could someone have pushed someone into a fire? Yes, anything was possible. We're talking about people who were extremely intoxicated and doing drugs. That was another thing. The detectives kept hearing people admit they were completely wasted out of their minds. They were on drugs that night and didn't remember anything. It was a pretty insane party for a lot of people. So they had to take each and every one of those tips and run with them. They searched the bonfire, and it turned out, after sifting through all of the ashes, there were no human remains found. Now that this tip brought police and detectives onto Mike's family farm, they joined Chelsea's family and friends. They were out there in those fields behind Mike's house with their ATVs and their search dogs, but they didn't find anything in those fields or in the woods surrounding the farm. They combed it inch by inch. This wasn't a one-day search. These searches were going on every day. This entire time, people from the community were rallying together for this family. Because this party was so highly publicized and so many people did come out to it, there were so many who wanted to help. They wanted to be involved in finding Chelsea. Investigators were being very diligent. They were working fast, categorizing different leads, different tips, and people with information that they could use to pinpoint a select few they really wanted to speak to. Of course, they brought in all of Chelsea's friends, Becky, Laura, Heather, and Penny. When Penny heard what happened, Chelsea was missing and never came home that night, she felt regret. She said there was a lump in her throat. She didn't think anything bad happened in Monroe County. She just figured, she could be at a friend's house. Maybe something happened, but it definitely wasn't anything sinister. She just felt bad. Who wouldn't? You left your friend there alone. Early Tuesday morning, Becky actually got a knock on her door, and it was police. She was still expecting Chelsea to turn up, and she didn't realize how serious this was. But she was finally putting it together. She was thinking, could she be partially responsible for what happened because she left her friend? She took her friend's cell phone, so all of these things were going through Becky's head. She told the police everything she knew. She also turned over all of Chelsea's belongings, including her cell phone. Becky decided to turn to Facebook to get the word out so that people could start looking for Chelsea. Penny was doing the same. As soon as she found out how intense and serious it was, she was out there every single night searching. She would put her kids to bed and meet with the search parties looking for Chelsea. They must have felt some sense of responsibility. That's the way I would be feeling. I'm not trying to project my feelings onto these individuals. This is what I heard them say in interviews, and I'm just saying I would feel the same. No one who was with her that night was feeling good about the fact that they left her alone. Investigators also asked friends about Chelsea's dating life, and they told them, no, she's single. She wasn't even seeing anyone. But of course, there were a couple of guys that she was interested in, but nothing more than that. Police wanted to know this information because they wanted to know if anyone could have picked her up that night, a boyfriend, an ex, someone she was seeing. So they brought in every single guy that Chelsea had ever been, even remotely involved with. They interviewed them, searched their homes, their cars, and took DNA samples, everything they could do, but they got no leads. So many people at this point were actually utilizing Mike's farm as a search command post, somewhere that everyone could gather. Mike even gave them a generator so that they would have electricity to run their laptops and other things that they might need. Chelsea's friends and family were camped out there in a tent. And the police definitely talked to Mike, by the way. Of course they did. Her friends gave the entire story of what happened, what they knew, and the next person they really wanted to dig into was Mike himself. Mike had a lot to say. First of all, he wasn't exactly happy speaking to investigators. You know why? Because he was greeted by the SWAT team. That's right. They paid him a very unpleasant visit as far as he was concerned, and they weren't very nice to him. He tried to let them in, but they were nasty to him. According to him, they took him, threw him on the ground, and even threatened to shoot his dog. I cannot tell you why they were so aggressive. I have no clue. I don't know why that happened, but they ended up searching all throughout Mike's home, his backyard, through the fields, and they started digging. They were digging up all sorts of areas. Mike said they dug up things that he had burned and buried when he was back in high school. He felt like he was being blamed for Chelsea not coming home that night. He did feel horrible. He felt horrible for her family. He couldn't imagine what it would be like. But he just didn't know what else he could do. All he was at fault for was throwing a party, or was he? That's what the investigators wanted to find out. He tells the police, "I've been having parties like this on and off since high school, and they've always had a decent turnout." But he never expected anything like this to happen. He never expected this many people to show up, so he can't even tell you who was there. He has no idea. There were so many that they ran out of parking and people had to park on the streets. He tells investigators that around midnight until 2 a.m., he was actually out there trying to get people off of the streets. Mike was experienced in throwing parties like this. He's an entertainer, a vocalist in his band. All he was trying to do was set up a nice fun place for people to have a good time. Honestly, he kind of thought people were overreacting. Sometimes people get drunk, and sometimes they go home with someone and might not turn up for a couple of days. He didn't know Chelsea personally, so he was just thinking, you know what, this girl is just drunk somewhere. And that's what he told investigators, maybe she's just drunk somewhere. It didn't really look good when he showed up with blood all over himself after searching the fields. He didn't know that his dog was going to get hurt, and he's carrying him with blood all over himself. Maybe that's why the SWAT team attacked him. He kept explaining that he tried to do everything right. He had 15 security guards that were there on scene during the party. He organized everything, from the parking to the porta potties to having water and anything anyone needed. He even had parking attendants who were actually organizing and escorting people to the party near the tents. He took a whole week off of work to prepare for this party. He had to wait to get the tents delivered and all those porta potties. It was a lot of work, and he really was trying to be as responsible as he possibly could. Finally, they had gotten enough information from Mike. There was nothing leading them to believe that he was involved in Chelsea's disappearance. But that definitely didn't stop the public and the media from coming by and going through the fields at his farm at all hours of the night. There was one lady who came out there at like 3 o'clock in the morning with her dog to search his entire yard, and he just let it happen. There were drones above, people peeking into his windows at night, and helicopters flying over his house. This was a life-changing event for him. He was starting to feel like he wasn't even safe in his own home. You know how people can point fingers at someone just because of the way he looked? People were passing judgment on him because of his band, because of the name of his band, Pickaxe Preacher, and the type of music he sang. Everything they did was judgmental. But investigators had to move on to other leads, and they were definitely coming in. They ended up speaking to this guy, Gavin Hewlett. He's the one who said Chelsea was crying and approached him to use his phone about 1 o'clock in the morning. She told him that her friends had left her at the party. Another partygoer named Alexandria Fraunhofer had a similar story to tell. She said Chelsea asked her to use her phone somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, still trying to find a ride home from the party. Who was Chelsea calling? Well, we know one of those phone calls was to Laura. She spoke to Laura, and that's when Laura told her, "Sorry, I had to leave. I gave all of your things to Becky." Another one of those phone calls was to Penny, and Penny unfortunately let her know that she was already at home and in bed when she called. She was in no shape to be driving, so she couldn't come get Chelsea. It's so sad. Looking back, it makes you think. It just makes you think about your choices. But at this point, they still hope to find Chelsea and find her alive. When they asked Heather how the party was, she said it was unruly. There were people being kicked out because they were fighting. Even though there were so many people providing information, they still didn't have anyone who could put Chelsea somewhere with someone. They didn't know where she was going or who she was leaving with until police started to look through video footage. There were so many people there that, of course, a lot of them had phones, and they were taking pictures and videos for social media. So they collected a ton of video footage. I have some of it here of just the party so you can see what it looks like. It does look fun, lots of people hanging out and dancing. But there was someone spotted in the crowd. I didn't have the full details about everything, but apparently there was a guy selling merchandise. He was selling band t-shirts and helping out, and he was also there until the very end of the night. Some people saw him in the same vicinity as Chelsea when she was walking toward the gravel road. A lot of them had their cars full, and they were not going in her direction to maybe give her a ride. You know, many people don't live back in maybe Michigan. People were from Detroit and elsewhere, but they spotted that one guy. They actually put this out to the media and said if anyone has information about who this guy is, he's not a suspect. He's not in trouble. He's just someone we're looking to as a witness, somebody who could give them information about what he saw, because he could have been one of the last people who saw Chelsea alive. The person that gave the information in the video of this man selling merchandise said that he had dark hair and a thin mustache. He was wearing a black hooded sweatshirt with a black leather vest over it. It turns out when they tracked this witness down, he said, "Yes, I remember seeing Chelsea. I saw her leaving with a guy around 3 o'clock in the morning." But he told them there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. They were just having a normal, casual conversation. They are now able to put Chelsea with someone. This is big. They say, okay, so let's get a sketch artist in here. We have to know what this unidentified man looks like. So I want to show you what the sketch looks like. Here it is. He's a guy wearing a sweatshirt of some kind, maybe a hoodie. He's got glasses, some facial hair, and it looks like his hair is kind of swept over his forehead. This is the best description that had been provided by this guy who saw Chelsea leave with a man that looked like this at 3 o'clock in the morning from the parking area at the Halloween party. This is what they have, this is what they're going on, and this is what is released to the media and to the public. They just want answers at this point. Crime Stoppers has gotten involved, they've done segments on it, and they have a reward. That reward just keeps getting bigger until it's about $30,000 for any information leading to an arrest or finding Chelsea. They don't know if she's been taken or if she's been harmed. For all they know, this could just be another guy, another witness. Chelsea was seen walking with this unknown man, but nobody saw where they went or if they had gone to a vehicle or somewhere else. This is just all they knew. So Cassandra and her mom are doing interviews. There are a lot of newspapers that are doing articles about Chelsea's disappearance, and the family is encouraging people to share photos on social media so they could get the word out because she could be anywhere at this point. They're also making posters and putting up flyers all around town. They're being handed out at grocery stores and gas stations. Everyone in Mabee and in Monroe County is putting up these flyers. By November 4th, this was printed in the Detroit Free Press. They have a map here showing the location where Chelsea was last seen, Post Road and Williams Road in Frenchtown Township, Monroe County. As soon as I saw this, I went and pulled it up on Google Maps. I thought, okay, maybe this is the area right here, because see how large this piece of land is. I thought, okay, maybe this is where it took place. You can see how vast this farm is. We're looking at it from a bird's eye view. The wooded area, the cornfields, the fields. There must have been a lot for them to search, and still they turned up nothing. But there are just so many places someone could be out there, so much land. It is like in the middle of nowhere. It really is truly like trying to find a needle in a haystack, as they say. A candlelight vigil was set up. Everyone gathered, friends, family, relatives, and partygoers, to support the family and be a shoulder to cry on. Even Chelsea's bus driver from when she was younger attended and spoke at the vigil, as well as Cassandra, Megan, and Chelsea's mom. This is Megan and Cassandra on stage, speaking about their sister, telling the crowd what Chelsea was like, and hoping that someone will be able to find her. Leonda worked at the bank for several years, and there was this one branch that was only being used for ATM purposes. So her boss actually gave her the keys and permission to use this as a search operations center. They had 100 volunteers that were coming out every single day outside of the bank. So now they have their own place they can set up. This was November 4th. It hadn't been that long, and this many people were coming out. Leonda just kept saying, if you give up hope, you have nothing. If I give up hope, the family gives up hope and the volunteers all go home. I won't let my volunteers go home. There were thousands of flyers that had been posted and handed out, and there were hundreds of acres that had already been searched, and still they found nothing. At this bank branch, there were people going over maps. They were strategizing with one another. They were bringing in food, coffee, and donuts, and they even organized a Facebook group that had around 7,000 members at the time. Here is one of the flyers right here on the screen, and this is Leonda standing next to it. Chelsea Ellen Bruck, age 22, last seen at a Halloween party. It gives the address. She's 5'7", 140 pounds, blonde hair and green eyes with a tattoo behind her right ear. At this point, Michigan State Police have actually joined in, and they're doing their own search. But no matter how many people are coming together, they still weren't finding anything. Months were going by, but between those months, everyone was encouraged to wear purple, which was Chelsea's favorite color, so that they could constantly be reminded that she was not there with them, and to keep her in their minds. We have different flagpole events in our lives, seasons, celebrations, and things we look forward to with our families. Chelsea's family was looking forward to her coming home by Thanksgiving, and then by Christmas. This is a Catholic family. They're a religious family. They're holding out hope, they're praying, and trusting that God is going to give them a sign or an answer. They just want an answer to their prayers. They want to have Chelsea come home, but the holidays just came and went, and the new year was upon them. It was 2015, and they rang in the new year without getting any closer to finding out what happened to Chelsea. But there is a turning point. They're about to get some very terrifying information, vital information, from a woman that calls into the police station. Her name is Carrie Carr. She's frantically telling police that her boyfriend has just confessed to killing Chelsea, and of course, they are stunned. They immediately bring her in for questioning. I have a portion of this interview I want you to actually listen to, and I will relay it to you as well in case the audio is weird.
When I went to go leave, I walked out and I was trying to get in my car.
Okay.
Pulled out a knife. Okay, a pocket knife.
Okay.
And then he goes, "This is the one I used on Chelsea."
Apparently, her and her boyfriend were going through a breakup. They got into this huge fight, and when she tried to leave to get out to her car, he chased her down with a pocket knife. He said, "This is the one I used on Chelsea." She explains that her boyfriend actually tells her he went to that party, he left with Chelsea, and at some point he's responsible for taking her life and dumping her body in a cemetery in Toledo. Now, he was threatening to kill Carrie too. But you see, when she starts to explain this, she says her boyfriend didn't actually say Chelsea's last name. According to her, he just says, "I use this on Chelsea. Don't make me use it on you."
He grabbed me by my shirt and he had a knife and he goes, "This is what I used with Chelsea Bruck." He didn't say her name exactly.
What did he
said,
say? I
"This
need
is
to
what
know
I used
exactly.
on Chelsea.
Okay.
Don't make me use it on you."
So detectives are a little concerned that maybe this really isn't that accurate. She doesn't sound stable or well put together, her story's all over the place, something doesn't add up. But they do have to take it seriously, of course they do. These investigators have been doing this for a long time, and they can see signs, they can see patterns. They really felt like there was something else going on. And as they started to question Carrie more and more, she kept saying how she wants him arrested right away and not to be released. It seems like she might have had a motive for giving this information to police.
"I want him locked up, but I can't have him questioned and then released. He lives on the same street as me.
Right.
He's going to come after me and my kid."
Well, they immediately bring this guy in and tell him everything that's going on. But before they even say Carrie's name, he tells them, "Okay, I've got this girlfriend, and we're on and off. We have a lot of problems. We've always had a lot of problems in the past. She kind of retaliates against me, and I honestly think she's just making up the story to put me behind bars." And it turns out that as unbelievable as it is, unbelievable that people can do this, that's exactly what this girl Carrie did. She was arrested for it. She was arrested for giving false information to police and interfering with an investigation, all because she wanted to get back at her boyfriend. So here she is literally saying that Chelsea had been killed and that this man did it, and it was all a lie. And this was one of 2 people who were arrested for lying to police. The other one was a 19-year-old guy named Harlan Bird, who came forward in February 2015. He told investigators he saw 2 men harassing Chelsea at the party, and he came to her rescue. He said he was yelling at them, trying to help her, but they took her and drove off. Well, it turns out, as they dug deeper and had more questions for Harlan, he changed his story and said he made up the whole thing. I wonder if this guy was trying to collect on the reward from Crime Stoppers. I don't know. But that's just sad, and it's really low. It's very selfish. And there's something else that's shocking that I just wanted to segue into for just a moment. While all this is going on, Cassandra and Leonda are the ones that are really leading the charge when it comes to the search efforts. There's someone who can really relate to what Cassandra is going through, and that's Cassandra's best friend, Jennifer. This was shocking to me. It's Jennifer Nice. Wonder, Leonda had been friends with Jennifer's mom, Kimberly Turnquist, for over a decade. Because Cassandra and Jennifer were such great friends growing up, when Jennifer's twin sister Julia went away to Eastern Michigan University, she was killed in 2012. She was only 23 years old when she was found murdered in her off-campus apartment in her bathtub. They have still not found her killer. This poor girl was found face down, partially nude. Her phone was thrown in the bathtub, her pants were cut off. She was bound at the wrist and at the ankles, and she had been tied up with a robe that she had left hanging on her bathroom door. When they got the evidence back, there were 2 sets of male DNA found on her. Her entire apartment was ransacked, but there was no forced entry and nothing was taken. Her computer was still there, her wallet and her purse. The only items that were missing were her pillowcase and a dresser drawer. Your best friend had a twin sister who was murdered just a couple of years before your own sister goes missing around the same age. So these 2 families are coming together and they're supporting one another, even though at this point, the Bruck don't know what happened to Chelsea. But losing someone, whether you know what happened to them or not, just the fact that you lose someone isn't very relatable. Cassandra has a best friend who has gone through this, and that case was so interesting for me to read about as well. Her grandfather is still fighting for someone to solve that case. It has been turned over to the Cold Case Foundation. With the advances in DNA evidence, it is so shocking to me to think that they cannot find out who did this type of thing to someone so innocent. I don't want to delve into the case for today. I just thought that was a very interesting fact. It's not every day I come across something like this when I'm researching, and this brought Leonda together with Kimberly for a memorial for Julia in the midst of Chelsea being missing. But something big is about to be uncovered. On March 22, 2015, a woman named Cheryl Retzleff was cleaning her yard, months' worth of debris across the county road that she lived on, like she does every spring. She came across a red shoe, a red flat, Mary Jane-type leather shoe on her 3.5-acre, partially wooded property on Moore Road, located 2.3 miles away from where the Halloween party took place, on the exact road that people would take to leave this party. The shoe was near a ditch with a lot of trash in it, and Cheryl always finds things like this. One time, she even found a camera hanging from a tree branch. She actually just put it in a trash bag and planned on throwing it away, but then when her husband came home, he asked, nonchalantly, "Oh, what'd you find today?" She mentioned the shoe. Now, considering how widespread Chelsea's story was, Cheryl's husband said, "You know what, if it's hers," and he didn't even have to say Chelsea's name. Cheryl knew who he meant. But she said, "No, it can't be. They've searched all winter. How could they have missed it?" But she calls the police anyway, just in case. The police come out, they take pictures of the shoe, collect it as potential evidence, and send a picture to Leonda. Sure enough, the shoe was identified as belonging to Chelsea. There are so many questions. Was Chelsea there? Could her shoe have fallen off as she was attempting to walk home? How would it get to this random ditch? Well, this area was searched and nothing else turned up. However, Approximately 1 week later, a man named Eric Kassab stumbled upon something while he and some of his friends were scrounging for scrap metal. They were at an abandoned industrial site, which was 10 miles from where the Halloween party had been held. It was out on Peters Road, right here near these railroad tracks. Eric had picked up this rotting piece of plywood, and he thought he saw something like a plant growing out from underneath it. But when he went to move the plant, he realized it was fake. So he picked it up and moved it, and then he noticed, oh, this isn't a plant, it's an outfit of some kind. Underneath it was a red wig. It freaked him out. He wasn't expecting to find those kinds of items in a place like that. His friends saw it, and he was like, dude, that's a poison ivy costume. The guy almost kept it because he thought it looked cool, but they ended up just leaving it there. Get this. A week later, when Eric was at work, he saw a missing persons poster with Chelsea's face on it and her wearing the poison ivy costume. He couldn't help but think, could this be what I found? So he thinks about calling the police and reporting it, but then he gets scared. He was around the same age as Chelsea. He knew all about the way DNA worked. Most of us have some kind of understanding of it. He did not want to be considered a suspect, so he goes about his life and tries to forget it. But over the course of the next week, it just keeps nagging at him, so he finally tells his sister about it during an Easter brunch. His sister didn't think twice. She said, you have to turn it in. You must. There's no other choice. She went so far as to tell him, listen, either you call the police, or I will. So he calls, he tells them what he found, and where they can find it. He gives them directions, the address to the building, all the details, and he doesn't think much of it. But as he's sitting down for Easter dinner with his family, his phone rings, and it's a detective. They say it's pretty suspicious that he waited a whole week to notify them, so they tell him, we need you to come down. Well, Eric suspected this would happen, and before I get into what happens next, I just want to say that I really believe there wouldn't have been connections like this between these items and these two different people who found them if Leonda hadn't been so devoted to Chelsea's cause. Just look at this headline from a month later. More than 1.2 million flyers have been sent out by Leonda and her team of supporters. She said that they almost hit every state because of one determined mother that is living out this nightmare of losing her child. This 52-year-old woman is spending 4 days a week for the past 6 months since her daughter had been missing. At this bank that she was using as a command post with family and friends, stuffing envelopes and putting flyers all around. And it paid off. Detectives probably wouldn't have these leads. Back at the station, they are grilling Eric. It turns out that the detectives think he's lying or that he's not giving them all the information. They ask him, did you go to that Halloween party? He says, no. But you know, I do have an ex-girlfriend, the mother of my child, and she lives over there. But not only that, she lived on Moore Road, the road that Cheryl lives on, the road where the shoe was found. Detectives want to know if he knew Chelsea, but he's adamant he did not. He says he was with his daughter that whole weekend, and he agrees to give them his DNA and his fingerprints. Turning away from Eric for just a moment, detectives make another connection, or I should say reconnection. Remember Harlan Bird, the 19-year-old that tried to come forth as a hero, saying, oh, I tried to save Chelsea to protect her, only to crack when they started questioning him further and say that he made up the whole thing? When the leotard and the wig were found, detectives realized they were found 100 yards away from the trailer park community where he lives with his grandma. You can pretty much see Harlan's house from where the costume was found, and they do not chalk it up as a coincidence. They bring him back in, and this time, he has an attorney. They want Harlan to explain why they end up finding Chelsea's clothing a walking distance from Grandma's trailer. He tells them he has no clue how those clothes got there, and it wasn't him that put them there. But he does admit, I have been to the abandoned building before. He says, unless someone's trying to set me up, trying to frame me, I cannot explain how her costume got there. He swore he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He agrees to take a polygraph test, and he provides a DNA sample. He passes the polygraph, no problem. Can people game polygraphs? Yes, but at least they have this guy's DNA, so if they're able to obtain any DNA from the items they find, they could get a match. DNA isn't going to make up stories. DNA isn't going to lie. So at this point, detectives are satisfied for now, and now they wait. They sent the leotard and the wig in for testing, hoping that some brown stains that were found on the leotard would end up being of significance and not just like spilled wine. I want to tell you more about the leotard because there were a couple of very significant findings. First, I told you about the stains, but now the straps. They were twisted, stretched, and torn. They appeared as though they were ripped off of Chelsea by force. Most significant, though, was the crotch area of the leotard. It had been completely ripped apart, detached, severed, if you will. It's pretty obvious to detectives that Chelsea did not willingly remove this garment from her own body. At this point, supporters and volunteers from the community have passed out over 300,000 flyers, with businesses donating the paper to create them. Pizza places were including them in every pizza delivery box. Because of this, Cheryl and Eric came forward, linking the items that they found to Chelsea's disappearance. Yet still no Chelsea. How did the shoe get so far from where the wig and the leotard were found? Where was she? Two of Chelsea's sisters were about to get married, one in about a month and Megan in June. Chelsea was in these weddings. She was looking forward to them. She would never miss those moments for anything in this world. So to her loved ones, it meant that she was no longer a part of this world. Now it's April 24th, 2015, 3 weeks after the discovery of Chelsea's Halloween costume at that abandoned building near the train tracks. John Marcon was doing construction on his 13-acre underdeveloped, heavily wooded property, which was also near some train tracks, but not the same ones where the abandoned building was. This was on Briar Hill Road in Ash Township, which is part of Monroe County, about 7 miles from where Big Mike's was located and 6 miles from that abandoned building. John and a construction crew were bringing bulldozers through an area that they were trying to clear to build a home. John was on the phone with his wife. He was hauling some dirt around in a dirt pile, and he was trying to squeeze the bulldozer through a really tight area when he got stuck in some wet dirt. So he gets out, goes behind the vehicle, turns to his left and sees something out of the ordinary. Something that really didn't look right. We can sense these things in a split second. Our brains can differentiate between something that's supposed to be somewhere and something that is just so out of the ordinary and unusual that it doesn't make sense. He saw what looked like a skeleton. He told his wife, "I gotta go," and quickly dialed 911. I actually have his 911 call, and I gotta warn you, it's bad. He is terrified. He's in shock. He's freaked out. He lets the operator know, "I just found a dead body on my property." The operator asks whether he could tell if it was a male or a female, and John doesn't hesitate. He says it's a female, it has hair, it's blonde. He says that he thinks it's the girl that's been posted all over town. Let me explain. John is just making an assumption. The body that he found was merely skeletal in nature. There was no face. It was severely decomposed. So was this Chelsea, or was it someone else? Michigan State crime technicians came out immediately to investigate. It's worth mentioning that there were sticks and logs that were placed on top of the remains, and it appeared as though someone had tried to cover it up. Investigating further, they find one single artificial ivy leaf nearby, and it looked exactly like the ones from Chelsea's leotard. They also find a pair of green leggings and another red shoe that matched the one they found on Cheryl's property. I mean, at this point, even without confirming the identity of the remains, they're fairly certain that they finally found Chelsea. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for a full examination, and it's a waiting game once again. However, the detectives do notify Chelsea's family, just in case. They were hoping it wasn't going to be Chelsea, but they knew that the media would be all over the story, so detectives wanted to personally let them know there's a possibility that this can be your loved one. A couple of days later, the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office used dental records to officially confirm the identity of the skeletal remains, and it was in fact Chelsea Bruck. Not only that, but it was determined that her cause of death was homicide. Anyone who may have been thinking that this woman walked off intoxicated, passed out, and died was wrong. Someone caused Chelsea to disappear, and further, their actions resulted in her death. The autopsy revealed the horrific truth about how Chelsea died. Her jaw was broken into 2 pieces, just broken in half. It takes a tremendous amount of force to cause those types of injuries, and there were a number of facial injuries. Several of her facial bones were fractured, for example, the areas around both of her eyes. Chelsea died from blunt force trauma to her head. There was no DNA or trace evidence found on the body itself, but Chelsea's blood was in the front inside portion of the leotard, and a male's DNA was also found. It's so obvious that this was a murder committed during a forced sexual act, but when they run this DNA through their CODIS system, they don't get any hits, and this case hits a dead end. But at least Chelsea's family can bring her home and lay her to rest. This horrific homicide shocked the small community. They just couldn't believe that anything like this could happen in Monroe, because these things didn't happen there. And everyone is devastated. Chelsea's family ends up sending out a message to the media, and they say thank you to everyone for your kind words and your prayers during this difficult time. We worked tirelessly for 6 months to find Chelsea. She has been returned to us, and we can take relief in knowing that she's with our Heavenly Father. Our faith is strong, and we continue to put everything in God's hands. We appreciate everyone's help, time, and funding, no matter how big or small. Receiving this news has been devastating to our family. I can't even begin to imagine a mother's pain like this. But Leanda no longer stayed up all night wondering where her daughter was, and she was finally able to put away all of Chelsea's laundry, which had been folded and left in a basket since the day Chelsea went missing. She just couldn't bring herself to put it away. It's so sad, and I'm so sorry for this family. Leanda also returned to her job as a bank teller. She was finally able to have some closure, but they still didn't know who did this to her daughter or why, until over a year later. That is when they get their next clue, and it's a big one. It was July 21st, 2016, and something unexpected happened. There was a hit on that DNA. It was a match to a 27-year-old man who grew up in Monroe County. However, compared to the way Chelsea grew up, these two were like night and day. His name is Daniel Clay. His mom was in prison when he was born, so he was put up for adoption right away. Unfortunately, life did not get better for Daniel. His adoptive parents got a divorce when he was 5 years old, and he ends up living with his adopted father until he died when Daniel was 17. There was nowhere for him to go, so he was put in a children's home. Growing up, Daniel never had any stability. He got into drugs as a teenager and was always getting in trouble. By 18, Daniel was out of the youth home but still doing drugs. He had odd jobs here and there. He worked at a gas station and restaurants, but he never kept a job for more than a few months, and he never had a place to live. He just slept on friends' or girlfriends' couches. He ended up getting one of those girlfriends pregnant, but didn't want anything to do with the child. He wouldn't even pay child support, which led to warrants being issued for his arrest. He was in trouble with the law too. Things like battery, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, drug charges, sexual misconduct, and most recently, in May of 2016, larceny for stealing someone's backpack. When he was booked for that, he didn't even spend the night in jail, but because of a new law, they were able to take his DNA, and that is what led to the match. Detectives were eager to get Daniel into the station. They had so many questions. They weren't questioning whether this was their guy. It had to be, right? He fit the mold. He was a criminal with a rough upbringing who knew this area and was probably at that party. He also had a pending charge for forced intercourse and lived close to where the party was held. So why else would his DNA be where they found it? He had a warrant out for his arrest for failure to pay child support. So on July 22nd, they surrounded the house he was staying in and arrested him, bringing him in. Daniel thinks that he's being arrested merely related to the child support, but detectives begin to move toward the questions regarding the Halloween party. Daniel has no problem admitting, "Yeah, I went," but he says he didn't stay long. When they asked him if he knew Chelsea, he said, "Oh, I know who you're talking about. Of course." He was basically like, yeah, there are posters everywhere. She's the blonde girl. She went missing. But he denies ever meeting her or knowing her. He says that he just watched things on the news about Chelsea. But what about the DNA? I hate liars, and this guy in particular makes my skin crawl. Just wait, because the things he says in this interview and later are the reasons that I decided to do this case. There's never enough awareness brought to these kinds of cases with these types of people, and he was being really arrogant. He was telling detectives that he was a real ladies' man, and that, oh yeah, I definitely knew a lot of women, just not Chelsea. He goes on to say, oh, you know, I even knocked up a couple of women, and I had kids with them, and I have a third one on the way with another lady. Okay, buddy, it just makes me sick. He says, I live like it should be the 70s, free love. I like peace and love, that's my motto. He says he doesn't like fighting or violence, just smoking weed and having sex. Well, Daniel, does that include taking it by force? He goes on to brag about how confident he is, how he can get any girl, and the detectives are just playing him. They're just like, wow, you're lucky, man.
You're a lucky man. I wish girls would well, I think I'm a pretty confident kind of guy.
That's when detectives ask him, is there any reason that your DNA would be on Chelsea's clothes? They tell him, we have your DNA, we have it, and it's on her clothing. Can you tell us why you would be there? And he's like, no, I can't think of a reason why I would be anywhere near or on Chelsea.
I did not do anything to that girl. Did not. Telling you.
I think Daniel may have been thinking, wait a minute, if I say there's no reason that the DNA would be there, it means I can't explain it away. So his story starts to change. Detectives are super patient, and they have to be in order to get to the bottom of things. This is when detectives have to play like good cop, saying, oh, we don't think you're a murderer. No, that's exactly what they think. Finally, Daniel basically says, oh wait, yeah, you know what? Now that I think about it, I did have sex with a woman that night at the party. Yeah, I don't know how I could have forgotten about that. But yeah, I met a girl, and we went into my car and went into the back seat, and we had sex, and then we just went our separate ways.
So that means I had sex with someone, and I just don't know. I think I was out in the car with somebody, and then not long later I talked to my baby mama, got in the car, and left. Okay? I do not think you're a murderer. I'm being upfront. Okay? I'm being honest with you. I've been honest with you 100%. Okay? Alright? I think something happened. You did not have any intent to hurt her. I didn't do anything to her. She just saw anything when I left her. She got out of the car and walked away.
Because all along, Daniel was assuming the DNA was semen. That's why he's admitting to having consensual sex with some girl that could have been Chelsea. However, Daniel was obviously not thinking with his other head, because the DNA of Daniel's that the detectives found was actually skin cells on the areas of the leotard that were ripped. That's incredible. Think about it for a moment. The portions of the straps being pulled caused skin cells to come off of his hands. The force used to pull them apart, the straps and the crotch area were torn, and her leggings had been ripped open along the seams between the legs.
I have your DNA where her stuff was torn. Nobody else. Nobody. No one. Okay? Either something happened where it was intentional, unintentional, accidental. No, I didn't do that to her. Or was it an accident? I had sex with a girl, that's it.
And only Daniel's DNA was in those areas related to tearing off articles of clothing. Now, what was Daniel going to do? He had already lied so many times that he didn't know Chelsea, that he never saw her at the party, that he never had sex with her. Well, now it was the detectives' turn to lie, and I love this part. They had to get Daniel back in their hands, and they're allowed to lie. It's a tactic. Some may not agree with it, but it's allowable in these interrogations. So they lie and say that they know something that the media doesn't, something about Chelsea that only her mother knows. Don't forget, this is a lie. She has brittle bone disease, a condition where even the slightest punch or bump or bang can cause her bones to fracture. Detectives are trying to insinuate that there could have been an accident just by Daniel having sex with her. Now they wait,
And I'm going to tell you one thing that nobody knows about Chelsea Bruck except us and her mother, is that she had brittle bone disease. Brittle bone disease is a simple touch. Yeah, I break myself. Okay? So that's what happened. It was an accident.
And Daniel's trying to come up with his next lie. His story changes once again. He says, well, there was a second time that we had sex. I was driving away from the party, and I saw Chelsea carrying her wig while she was walking down the road by herself. He says he stops and is so polite. He asks her if she needs a ride home. So, she gets in, and this second time she wants to have sex, but she wants to get freaky. He says that she wants him to choke her. This is his story. That this girl who met him that night trusts him enough to let him put his hands around her neck for some erotic asphyxia. He says she was just so intoxicated, she became aggressive, and she was biting him, smacking him, and yelling for him to choke her. And he said, I did what she asked. I held her for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. And all of a sudden, her body went limp. He said he tapped her face and realized she wasn't breathing. He said, I guess I choked her too hard. He adds, I wasn't even choking her that hard. I didn't think so. And he has the audacity to add this, that he's had many girlfriends that like to be choked and he knows how to do it. But he didn't realize she had brittle bone disease. He's trying to act like a hero. He says, I tried to do CPR, but I don't know how to do it. So Daniel, women allow you to practice erotic asphyxia without knowing how to revive them if things go wrong. I'd argue that's part of knowing how to do it.
She told me to choke her. I choked her. Then we switched, but she got underneath me. And like, I don't know, for a minute, and then she kind of stopped and she went limp, so I stopped. And I'm like, you know, and I started tapping her face. And okay, I guess I choked her too hard or something like that. I wasn't even choking her that hard, I didn't think. Okay? I've got girlfriends that like to be choked and stuff. I know how to do it. Like, I didn't realize her bones were brittle over.
Then he says he freaks out, puts her in the back of his car, and he's scared. He doesn't know what to do, so he just drives and drives until he can figure out what he should do next, eventually deciding to dump her body in a wooded area near some train tracks. But what about her items of clothing being 5 and 7 miles apart? How does he explain that? I know it's not my place to tell you what I think, but I do think he took her to that abandoned building. Maybe she threw her own shoe out the window to leave a clue, who knows? But I just know this man is a liar, and he swears he has no idea how her things got scattered. Really? Detectives also have their theories. They think something must have set Daniel off. Either he had this plan all along, watching women come and go in and out of this party like a hunter just waiting for the right victim, and he found it in Chelsea, or maybe she did ask for a ride. We know how desperate she was to get home that night, and she made the mistake of trusting a guy who looked relatively normal. Maybe he pulled a move on her and she resisted, so he beat her into submission. We just won't know because Daniel lies. They arrested Daniel Clay for murder, but before the news has even gotten out, someone has leaked the info to Chelsea's friend Becky, a co-worker from Olga's kitchen, a woman named Jessica. But how did she find out? Well, Daniel told her himself. It turns out, Jessica was the mother of Daniel's son, and she was the one phone call that Daniel made when they booked him. He called her 2 times while she was at work that day, and left voicemails saying that he was sorry, that he had messed up big time, and that he was going to be gone for a really, really long time. So Jessica was crying hysterically to Becky, and when she was finally able to compose herself long enough, she said, "My son's father killed Chelsea, and I'm so sorry." And get this, when investigators trace that call, they question Jessica about what she may know, and she tells them she remembers Daniel coming up to a group that both she and Chelsea were a part of. They were all talking in that group at that Halloween party, but she doesn't remember what the conversation was about. Later, she said she smoked some weed with him, and then she remembered seeing Chelsea between about 1 and 1:30 in the morning. So this man was actually in a group of people with Chelsea. His ex works with Chelsea. He saw Chelsea walking. He killed her, most likely because he isn't confident. He isn't a ladies' man that can get any girl he wants, at least not a girl like Chelsea. Daniel pleaded not guilty. He only confessed to an accidental death, not murder. In May of 2017, he went to trial. He literally tried representing himself at one point, and he took the stand. These types of people do that sometimes. They're just so arrogant. But eventually, he does get a court-appointed attorney, and his trial lasted 10 days. Daniel tried to argue he accidentally asphyxiated Chelsea, but Chelsea died of blunt force trauma with intense force, which was not an accident at all. Daniel tried to argue that those fractures were actually due to the fact that he had trouble carrying Chelsea. He couldn't carry her dead body through the woods and kept dropping her because he was so intoxicated that he kept blacking out. In that case, he didn't even care about her after he did what he did. No regard. But we know he's lying, and to drive that point home, the prosecution had a doctor testify about manual strangulation. They stated that you gotta hold someone's neck hard enough to cut off that air and blood flow and keep it cut off for an additional 2 minutes, post-loss of consciousness. So after she went limp, an additional 2 minutes would have been needed. They brought in a CPR mannequin to demonstrate this to the jury, saying even if Daniel was telling the truth, this is how long he would have needed to hold his hands around her. I love demonstrations like this. So the prosecutor sat in front of the jury and took the mannequin, and for 2.5 whole minutes, he held his hands around the mannequin's neck. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before finding him guilty of felony murder. The felony was a criminal sexual conduct, which we use the R word for here in California. Daniel tried to argue to the court, but the judge, also named Daniel S. White, said this: I spent 10 days in trial with Mr. Clay, and I listened to countless hours of him changing his story every time the detectives questioned him or brought up something new. It was very clear to me, Mr. Clay, you're a liar, a brute, and a killer. And I agree. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and in a separate and pending case, Daniel was found guilty of forced intercourse on another woman that took place back in 2016. After what he did to Chelsea, he had broken into this woman's home and forced himself on her. For that, he got an additional sentence of 40 to 75 years, and the judge said this was a brutal rape. It was degrading, dehumanizing, and Mr. Clay, you're just an opportunist and a predator. You're a liar and a serialist. As for Chelsea's mom, she shared with the media that she had forgiven Daniel and given him a Bible, which Daniel said he would keep. Leanda also wanted to give a message. If you go somewhere with your friends in a group, leave in that same group, 2 in, 2 out. That's my motto. If I go somewhere with you, I am not going to leave you behind. Don't leave anyone behind. Tonight is Halloween. Don't leave anyone behind. Every day, there's an opportunity to go somewhere where you may not know people. Don't leave someone behind.